Good morning. The Commerce Committee will come to order. Today, the Commerce Committee is meeting to consider the nomination of Gigi Sohn to be Commissioner for the Federal Communications Commission. This committee has already held 2 previous hearings on her nomination, and so we know a lot about her background, her views, and important transparency issues, and we thank her for being here again today. If we want someone on the Federal Communications Commission who is truly committed to the job, then I believe Ms. Sohn fits that bill. She has a very long history at being part of a process at the FCC, and she is qualified. She will help deliver for the American people, and she has a key eye on something that all members of this committee care passionately about, and that is affordable, accessible broadband. Thank you for your leadership and your advocacy on that issue. Although she has been before our committee, she has now been criticized for important policies like standing up for free speech. I want to thank you for your policy positions, knowing that some same people like Justice Gorsuch or Rand Paul or many others believe in the Fourth Amendment. Thank you for articulating those views as well. These personal attacks are a distraction from the fact that Ms. Sohn is immensely qualified for this position and a highly effective would-be FCC commissioner. She has more than 30 years of experience working on telecommunications policy, including as senior advisor to Chairman Wheeler at the FCC. She's a prominent voice in the telecommunications area, importantly, as I mentioned, on accessibility and affordability. And if confirmed, she would be the first openly gay commissioner of the FCC. Ms. Sohn has a history of putting the public interest first, regardless of whether that means supporting policies endorsed by Republicans or Democrats. She is well known for convening a broad range of stakeholders from both sides of the aisle on almost every part of the debate that we are looking at: regulatory frameworks, broadband deployment, broadcast issues, and mass media in the marketplace. This is why her nomination is supported by such a diverse group of people. Former Mississippi Representative Chip Pickering, who stated that Ms. Sohn will be a great advocate in championing of the principles of competition and the First Amendment. Preston Patton, former president of ABC and founding executive director of Fox Broadcast, who stated that she has worked with and with various individuals for 30 years and is one of the most prepared and experienced nominees. And Mr. Chris Ruddy, CEO of Newsmax, who has urged the confirmation of Ms. Sohn's nomination and the fact that she is committed to promoting diversity, localism, and competition in the marketplace. So it is no surprise that Ms. Sohn's career includes helping to ensure the carriages of all voices are heard. This is something this committee has to continue to work on, and I welcome the opportunity to work with my colleague, the ranking member, on this important issue. I know he has many views on this as well. But those many voices do include Fox Broadcasting, Newsmax, and O1 networks, some of the very same networks that our colleague wrote a letter about when they were deplatforming the large cable providers. So Ms. Sohn has been a consistent advocate for pro-consumers, common sense policies such as lowering the cost of broadband and working towards universal connectivity. Given that there is a great deal of work that needs to be done on this issue at the FCC, it is time to have a full commission. We know that just a sampling of the work includes the oversight of their mapping efforts, making sure that we put a stop to robocalls, caller ID spoofing, ensuring the United States adopts cutting-edge, forward-looking spectrum policies, and many other issues. I know she will be that voice, and it is critical that we have one right now. We know that she is capable of helping us implement what are the broadband deployments that we have just put a lot of resources against. But I would ask those who are trying to reposition Ms. Sohn to think about who it is you're really advocating for. The billions of dollars that people want to continue to have an expensive broadband, or the policies that will help us get true competition in the marketplace and finally deploy the types of broadband services that every American deserves. I hope that our hearing will help bring these issues that haven't been brought to light further to light, and that we have a healthy discussion, but we continue to respect the witness and her willingness to serve us at the FCC. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, the ranking member, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, I also appreciate your delaying this markup an hour so that we could all attend that classified briefing. I think it was important, and members on both sides were very interested in doing so. Vetting a nominee to the Federal Communications Commission is a serious task. The FCC is an agency with vast power over how Americans communicate and what information they access. It is also an agency with a history of abusing vague statutory provisions to pursue partisan policy goals. We know enough from today's extreme left what happens when power is put in the wrong hands. It doesn't take much to imagine a partisan FCC going down a dark path of attempting to censor what we see, hear, read, and ultimately think. As such, our responsibility as senators is to make sure that an FCC nominee not only has the expertise to be an independent regulator, but also possesses good judgment and temperament. The nominee must be fair, ethical, and perhaps most importantly, honest. On all of these fronts, this nominee has failed to meet the standard. There is a reason why we are on our third nomination hearing for Ms. Sohn. Both during this process and in her previous positions, she has shown herself to be a partisan who lacks the impartiality and candor necessary to serve in a leadership position at a powerful independent regulatory agency. And she has repeatedly displayed bad judgment and questionable ethics. She has associated herself repeatedly with the most radical views on the far left. I want to break down each of these points, but first let's recap how we got here. In March of 2020, Ms. Sohn joined the board of a streaming service called Locast, despite knowing that it was embroiled in a lawsuit arising from the group's piracy of broadcast content. The following year, the White House began vetting her for a spot on the FCC. During the vetting process, a reasonable individual might have stepped aside from Locast, but Ms. Sohn did not. Despite being considered to regulate the very same companies that were suing her organization for stealing from them, Ms. Sohn remained on Locast's board. Then in the fall of 2021, a federal judge found that Locast had engaged in illegal behavior, ordered it to stop operating, and awarded statutory damages of $32 million to the broadcasters. On October 26, 2021, President Biden announced his intent to nominate Ms. Sohn. Just one day later, Ms. Sohn signed an agreement settling the lawsuit. Ms. Sohn then hid significant details about the settlement from this committee. She actively misled senators about the settlement's dollar value and her ability to share settlement information with the committee. It's clear why. The settlement was a sweetheart deal. The broadcasters drastically reduced her organization's penalty by 98%, literally 2 cents on the dollar, from $32 million to $700,000. It was already improper that she executed a settlement with the broadcasters at the very same time she was being nominated to the FCC. But to then cut a sweetheart deal with them and to be dishonest with it, with members of this committee, is disqualifying. A basic requirement for public officials is trustworthiness. And on that front, Ms. Sohn has failed. If Ms. Sohn's brazen theft of intellectual property, her lack of candor, and her conflicts of interest weren't disqualifying on their own, then her long record of poor judgment should seal her fate. Just this past year, while her nomination was pending, Ms. Sohn was making multiple financial donations to senators who were charged with voting on her confirmation. Had this been done by a Republican nominee, I have no doubt that my Democrat colleagues and their media allies would be apoplectic at this point. But sadly, this level of unseemliness is a pattern with Ms. Sohn. She has engaged in extreme vitriol against her political opponents repeatedly, and she has endorsed far-left radicals' character assassination attempts against numerous Republican and Democrat senators, indeed multiple senators sitting on this committee. She has deep ties to far-left organizations, engages repeatedly in partisan attacks, and has also promoted anti-police views. For example, she retweeted and liked posts by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calling for defunding the police. And in July of 2020, during riots in Portland, Oregon, she retweeted a post attacking federal law enforcement officers as, quote, armed goons in riot gear with tear gas. It's no surprise that her nomination is opposed by multiple law enforcement groups, including the Fraternal Order of Police and the National Sheriff's Association. Ms. Sohn portrays herself as a defender of free speech, but she has a history of campaigning to censor conservatives. She calls Fox News, quote, dangerous to our democracy, and has urged the FCC to revoke Sinclair's broadcast licenses. At the same time, she has a history of fighting against indecency regulations that protect children from exposure to filth on TV. To Ms. Sohn, it seems that conservative speech is worse than obscenity. Madam Chairwoman, I do not believe this is a nomination that will earn the votes to be confirmed, and I do not believe her record is suitable to serve on the FCC.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'm going to call on the ranking member of the subcommittee, Senator Lujan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ranking Member Cruz, as the chair of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be here before you. Now, Ms. Sohn, it's been a year since you were last before the committee. Unfortunately, I missed your second hearing. I had a stroke, and it means a lot that you're back here so that I can fully participate in now your third hearing. In all full seriousness, I hope that there's a serious conversation today about your dedication and qualifications, and especially the dire need to fill the FCC. It's been 755 days that we don't have a full functioning FCC. I know that we want to get there. I hope that that's something that's supported by the entirety of the membership of this body. With each additional day, more ink is spilled over this nomination. Frankly, we get more deliberate attempts to extend this vacancy for as long as possible. Now, I'd like to take my time today to clarify the record and talk openly about what is happening. Fundamentally, this position remains vacant because the companies that are lawfully subject to oversight by the FCC don't want a watchdog. They don't want to be regulated, and these companies have spent an immense amount of money and influence to keep this position vacant. The more that I read, the more time that goes by, it seems more and more clear to me. And it's frustrating because I know the importance of what these entities mean to the country, especially with building out the importance of the infrastructure in a bipartisan bill that we all supported together, and especially for those of us in more rural states with what a full functioning FCC will mean. Chair Kamel, I ask for consent to enter into the record 5 documents.
Without objection.
A report by Margaret McKeel for Axios, an investigative report by Kat Kozowski and Cristino Lima for the Washington Post, Biden's internet promises in limbo amid long battle over FCC nominations, the mystery of Biden's deadlocked FCC by Nilay Patel from The Verge, and a report by Howard Buskert from Daily Communications on proposed fines against carriers for data violations appear stalled at a split FCC. A report by John Brodkin of Ars Technica ISP admits lying to FCC about size of network to block future funding. So I appreciate that. A few things to highlight in these. First, last December, Senator Thune and I convened a hearing on digital discrimination in our subcommittee on communications, media, and broadband. We heard extensive testimony on the need for the FCC to craft rules preventing digital discrimination on broadband access. These rules are required by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investments and Job Act. But there's a significant pressure coming in the docket, and some, like the Wall Street Journal editorial board, are trying to turn the bipartisan priority into a partisan fight. It shouldn't be. Second, multiple reports have found that ISPs, big and small, provided false data to the FCC's maps in an anti-competitive effort to block rival companies from getting a share of the $42.5 billion this committee provided for broadband. Third and finally, before Christmas, in December 2022, internal documents indicated that Chairwoman Rosenworcel proposed fines against major wireless carriers for failing to safeguard data on real-time locations. For most Americans, the FCC is the only cop on the beat, protecting them from predatory data practices and ensuring internet companies provide accurate information. Chairwoman Rose Worsham requires a full commission to do her job, enforcing current law to the fullest extent and to keep these companies accountable. We've heard from a lot of my colleagues. Now, some have suggested that you're not qualified. I disagree with that. The facts show that these arguments are just a bunch of hot air coming from a state with the largest international balloon fiesta. The record shows that Gigi Sohn is a dedicated public servant who's qualified and ready to be confirmed. She will act to uphold the law dutifully and honorably. Unfortunately, though, we're seeing this stalled for way too long. So, Madam Chair, I want to thank you and the ranking member and all of our colleagues for being here today, Ms. Sohn for being here yet again for this important hearing, and I look forward to a vote, not just out of this committee, but on the full floor to support your confirmation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I misspoke earlier. The chair of the subcommittee, Chairman Lujan. And now if the ranking member of the subcommittee, Senator Thune, would like to make a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we've all been down this road before. And I think that Senator Cruz in his opening remarks hit on a number of issues that I think I find disqualifying for the nominee. And we have big differences, I think, as perhaps a lot of people here know, when it comes to major policies. Ms. Sohn is interested in reinstituting the Obama-era heavy-handed net neutrality rules that were reversed under then FCC Chairman Pai in 2017. Rules that I would remind people would regulate the internet like a public utility under Title II of a 1934 law. So that in and of itself, to me, represents a major problem from just a policy standpoint. But I also want to reiterate some of the things that were mentioned by Senator Cruz in his opening remarks. And that is, I think, Ms. Sohn is an FCC official. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the issue of leaking non-public confidential information further speaks to the fact that if confirmed, you're not going to bring the spirit of bipartisanship that present and past commissioners demonstrated. Your long record, I would say, of virulent partisanship has raised a number of questions as to whether or not you can serve as an impartial commissioner, and I think those concerns remain. You've been outspoken critic, as Senator Cruz pointed out, of conservative media outlets that you would be in charge of regulating. You've supported far-left initiatives such as defunding the police, and you've been hostile, I would add, to broadband companies serving rural areas like those in my home state of South Dakota. So I would just close by saying that almost all, if not all, individuals in politics have strong convictions. But serious leaders demonstrate the ability to act in a fair and impartial manner. You have not. And Madam Chair, should this nomination come for a vote before this committee, I'd urge all my colleagues, for those reasons and many others, which I'm sure we'll get into, to join me in opposing the nominee before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Thune. Now we will have an introduction by Ms. Sohn by Mr. Chad Roop, who's joining us remotely. He was a Trump administration official for the Rural Utility Services Department of Agriculture. He has been a long leader in rural broadband and developing state directors board working group. So you are also active in the effort in Wyoming. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Chairwoman Cantwell and Ranking Member Cruz, members of the committee. My name is Chad Roop, and I'm currently the General Manager of Ponderosa Communications. And as the Chairwoman mentioned, I'm also the former administrator for the RUS under the Trump administration and the former State Broadband Program Manager for Montana. I'm here today, however, in my capacity as a friend of Gigi Sohn. And it's truly an honor for me to come before the committee to introduce her to you and to register my strong support for Gigi to be the next commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. During my time as the USDA Rural Development State Director for Wyoming and as the administrator for RUS, I led the Trump administration's efforts to get broadband to our rural communities, including through the Reconnect Broadband Program and implementation of the 2018 Farm Bill. It was as the state broadband program manager for Montana that I got to know Gigi and see how she approaches challenges like bringing broadband to rural America. I saw that Gigi was deeply passionate about the importance of working to close the digital divide for all of our communities. I saw that she understands the term rural means much more than a designation given to an area based on population. She knows that each one is unique and presents varying challenges to connectivity. Importantly, I saw that she firmly believes that these are not partisan issues, and when we make them partisan, we fail to serve the folks in those rural communities who are just looking to ensure their families are able to enjoy the many benefits that come from broadband connectivity. For the past 5 years, Gigi has worked closely with state broadband leaders from states as different as Vermont, Nebraska, and Louisiana, providing them with counsel and connections with federal broadband leaders. In her previous 2 confirmation hearings, Gigi pledged to be the FCC's state liaison, and I have no doubt she will keep that promise. Such a role is critical now that the states have primary responsibility for ensuring that the billions of dollars provided in the bipartisan infrastructure law is well spent. The FCC's work has been crucial to ensuring that the economic, health, and educational benefits that flow over broadband are reaching all of our communities. More work needs to be done for sure, and Congress has taken an all-of-government approach to moving that great work forward. And the role of the FCC in those efforts is as crucial as it has ever been. Gigi will be a great addition to the Commission as it seeks to fulfill the charge that Congress has tasked it with performing. And in closing, I would say to this committee that I was proud to learn that there are over 400 organizations and leaders that agree with me. Gigi will be a great commissioner. They include Republican and Democratic state and local legislators, business leaders, consumer advocates, and over 350,000 citizens. Gigi is a dedicated public servant and a strong voice for consumers and a hard worker who will bring her 35 years of work elevating the public's interest to the portfolio of work before the Commission. I urge this committee and the Senate to swiftly confirm her to this post. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Roop. Just one question for you. Are those the Tetons behind you?
That is Yosemite, actually, Chairwoman. Ponderosa Communications is proud to serve about 10,000 telephone and broadband subscribers in California, in the Sierra Nevadas, as well as in rural communities in Arizona. So fortunately, it's a great family-owned rural business that's been in operation since 1908. So we're very proud to serve these rural areas.
Thank you. It definitely is going to be a very big focus of this committee is to make sure that we get broadband expansion in rural communities. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that today. Ms. Sohn, welcome. If you want to introduce any family members, but you're welcome to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Cantwell, and good morning, Ranking Member Cruz and members of the committee. Today I'm joined by my wife, Laura, our daughter, Jocelyn, and my brother, Adam. I want to acknowledge my mother, Roma, who can't be here today. People who know her say that I get my determination and fortitude from her. Since there are several new committee members, let me introduce myself. I grew up with 3 brothers in a middle-class household on Long Island. I still say Long Island. My father was an accountant for the Grumman Corporation, and my mother was one of the first physician assistants certified in New York State. My formative years were filled with sports and music, including cheering for my beloved Mets and Jets. A broadcasting law course in my sophomore year at Boston University changed my life. I was fascinated with the power of communications networks to inform public discourse and promote democratic values, and was awakened to the important role government can play in ensuring that all voices are heard. After law school and private practice, I started what has been a nearly 35-year career as a public interest lawyer advocating for policies that ensure that modern communications networks are available to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they live. For the past 2 decades, I have worked towards the goal of ensuring that every U.S. household has robust and affordable broadband internet access. From 2013 to 2016, I was privileged to serve as counselor to then FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, where I gained the invaluable experience of working inside the agency and learning the different tools needed to be an effective policymaker. Today, at my third confirmation hearing, 15 months after I was nominated, I'd like to answer a question that I know is on the minds of many on the dais and in this room. Why am I still President Biden's nominee for the 5th seat on the FCC? There are 4 reasons. First, I care deeply about the mission of the FCC and have dedicated my entire career to that mission, ensuring that everyone, regardless of income level, race, gender, sexual orientation, or where they live, has access to affordable and robust communications networks so they can be full participants in our economy, our education and healthcare systems, our culture, and our democracy. I've accomplished a great deal as a public advocate, but after I left the FCC, I knew I wanted to one day return as a public servant to continue this important work. Second, I believe it's critical for at least one member of the FCC to be a consumer advocate who has spent a career not beholden to any interests but those of the public. I've certainly worked with industry towards common goals, and many in industry are among the over 400 groups that support my confirmation. But my roots and my heart are with everyday Americans the FCC by law is tasked to serve. Third, I'm extremely well qualified. Even those who oppose my confirmation agree that I have a deep knowledge of the issues before the FCC, and thanks to my time working at the agency, I know how it operates. I'm proud of my bipartisan network that includes pretty much every FCC stakeholder, including state and local officials, tribal leaders, industry, academia, public interest, public safety, civil rights, and the disability community. I know everybody, and they know me. They also know, regardless of whether we agree on policy, that I'm a straight shooter who will listen, try to find common ground, and take their equities into account. Lastly, I believe deeply that regulated entities should not choose their regulator. Unfortunately, that is the exact intent of the past 15 months of false and misleading attacks on my record and on my character. My industry opponents have hidden behind dark money groups and surrogates because they fear a pragmatic, pro-competition, pro-consumer policymaker who will support policies that will bring more, faster, and lower-priced broadband and new voices to your constituents. The FCC has been without a majority for the entirety of the Biden administration, over 2 years, at a time when closing the digital divide is front and center. There are too many important issues in front of the Commission to lack a full complement of members, including improving the broadband maps, fixing the Universal Service Fund, closing the homework gap, ensuring fair access to broadband, and protecting consumers' privacy. Americans deserve a full FCC where I could play a critical role in addressing every one of these. The time is of the essence. In closing, I want to give my heartfelt thanks to President Biden for his belief in me, to Chairwoman Cantwell and her staff for their constant support, and to the other committee members and their staffs who have worked so hard on my behalf and on behalf of the American people. If I'm confirmed, I look forward to working with all the members of the committee, as well as the sitting commissioners, to achieve universal connectivity in the United States. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Sohn. And I'm going to try to go quickly because we have 5-minute rounds, and I'm going to try to stick to that with everybody. And hopefully the comedy of this effort will get information out for people. So first of all, it is impressive that you have so many conservatives supporting your nomination. And I do think that speaks to your work for so many years in the field and your commitments to those issues of free speech. One of the issues, though, I kind of started thinking with all these attacks against you, I thought, well, this is a proxy fight for net neutrality. I think you and I have talked about that a little bit. And while I think that the commission has every right to deal with net neutrality, I think, me personally, I think the Congress is the best place to deal with that issue ultimately, because I think whatever the FCC does ends up probably in a legal dispute. So, but that aside, I started thinking the vitriol of these attacks made me think that no, it's even more than this, that somehow you are a smart, talented individual that's going to go there and fight for affordable broadband anywhere.
Absolutely.
And somehow, if affordable broadband gets deployed anywhere, then somehow more affordable broadband might get deployed everywhere. So I think there's probably billions of dollars at stake here. And that is why the vitriol is coming at you. Now, I hope that we can see through that today and really talk about the issues. I do want to talk about a couple of things, though, that have been brought up by my colleagues. So I'll get back to the issue of affordable broadband. So a lot of people have made things of tweets. These are retweets. Is that correct? Most of the things that people have talked about are retweets. Is that correct?
Retweets and likes, yes.
Okay. So I'm not saying I mean, we all should be held accountable, but my guess is I don't know that any of these people up here could be probably on any job if we looked at all of their tweets and retweets and looked at what people said. So to me, that's not the issue. Second, this letter from the Fraternal Order of Police. Do you support Edward Snowden?
No, I actually think Edward Snowden is a Russian asset. I do not support Edward Snowden, and I think it's important to say that when somebody is on the board of an organization, it doesn't mean that they agree with every single thing they do. I'm on the board of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm a proud board member, but they are involved in about 50 different issues. And there are some things I care deeply about and I agree with, some things I don't agree with at all, including their embrace of Edward Snowden, and some things, frankly, are not in my wheelhouse.
I agree with you. I think it gets complicated. I mean, Peter Thiel has given a ton of money to the EFF for awards for people that they think the EFF should be holding up. So listen, it goes a lot of different ways. But on this issue of information for law enforcement, you believe in making sure that there are warrants and that people can get access to this information. Is that correct?
Yes, if I'm confirmed, I will fully abide by CALEA, which the FCC does have a small role in. And yes, I do believe that law enforcement needs to abide by the First and Fourth Amendments. I don't think that's a radical position at all.
But people get confused on end-to-end encryption and think that there's no data available there, and there is data. And once it's decrypted, they could also get access to that data. Is that not correct? And you support law enforcement getting access both to the initial information and the decrypted information.
Yes.
Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think there's a misalignment here about what your view is, at least from the perspective of that letter. And I hope that we can continue to have some information and correction on that. And to this point of the settlement, again, another board that you were on and another settlement, which you didn't have anything to do with the details of the settlement. And in consequence, you also, when you were before this committee, were prohibited in talking about the exact details. I think my colleague, Senator Wicker, tried to get you on this point, but you were prohibited by law from discussing that settlement amount as a board member. So I just want, if you could clarify this again for the members quickly.
Yes, I think there's a couple of things that need to be clarified. First of all, I was bound by the settlement agreement. Okay, I was not a party to the litigation, so I never had any liability whatsoever. So this notion that, you know, I got some sort of sweetheart deal, there was never a sweetheart deal as to me. Frankly, there wasn't even a sweetheart deal as to Locast. So there was a settlement decided on October 12th. That was 2 weeks before I was nominated, and I did not know at the time that I was going to be nominated, that Locast would pay $700,000 to the networks. Then there was 2 weeks later, okay, the document that I signed talked about $32 billion. Now that was never, I'm sorry, Senator Cruz, you're wrong. The judge never said that there was a penalty of $32 million, and the judge never said that Locast had any liability whatsoever.
Well,
Okay.
we're going to get into this, and my time has expired, but I just, I want people to know you came to the second hearing after that decision, so we could have the airing. So I feel like you showed a great deal of transparency on this issue, and I appreciate it, and I'll have to get back to my lowering cost of broadband for the second round. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Sohn, this is your third hearing. That is highly unusual. One of the reasons that you've had three hearings is that in the first hearing, you went through the entire hearing without disclosing the sweetheart settlement concerning Locast. And the entire purpose of the second hearing was when that came to light. You actively misled Ranking Member Wicker when he asked you in writing about the $32 million settlement. You did not correct the record that it was in fact only 2% of that amount, $700,000. You also disclosed at that second hearing that you never notified the White House of this sweetheart deal, even though you signed it literally the day after they announced their intention to nominate you. My question is this: do you think that your failure to disclose the secret deal to this committee and your failure to disclose it to the White House, do you think that reflected poor judgment, yes or no?
No, I answered Senator Wicker's question honestly, okay? And on advice
So
of
no,
counsel.
you don't think it was poor judgment?
No, I do not, because
All right.
I was bound
All right,
by
I
the
wanna move the-
confidentiality agreement of the settlement.
With respect, no, you were not. The confidentiality agreement, section 6.0, prohibited you from communicating with the media or the press. The last I checked, the United States Senate is not the media or the press. You had an obligation to answer this body accurately, and you did not. I would note the White House is not the media or the press, and you told this committee you didn't inform the president of it either. Let me move on. You don't think it was poor judgment to mislead this committee or to mislead the president who was nominating you. Let me ask you a second question.
Senator, I
during the
don't
fi-
agree that I misled this committee, so I would like to make that.
The record is, I believe, abundantly clear, and in fact, I will be sending out my cross-examination from the last hearing, where you repeatedly mislead this committee in that hearing. And in fact, we'll go ahead and actually put this up. I'll note, I asked, did you disclose to the committee that agreement? I did. Did you disclose the agreement to the committee? I did. Hold on a second. Did you disclose to this committee? Yes or no? I did. You disclosed the $700,000 secret settlement? No. So 3 times you say I did, and then, oh, no. You did not. You misled this committee, and you also misled the White House. Let me ask you secondly, the 15 months that your nomination has been pending, you've made not 1, not 2, not 3, you've made 12 separate political contributions to senators running for office. I've been in the Senate 10 years. I have never seen a nominee make contributions to senators while your nomination is pending. I've never seen that once. I had my staff search the records. If we could find anyone in the Trump administration who had done that, my staff was unable to find that. You've been a significant political donor over the years, giving over $32,000. You gave. Do you believe it was poor judgment to give 12 separate political contributions to Democrat senators while your nomination was pending?
Senator, I'm a citizen who just wanted to participate in the
yes or no?
Democratic
Do you
process.
think
The
it's
answer
poor
is no.
judgment to cut checks to senators who are voting on your nomination while it's pending? No other nominee that we can find has ever done that. Do you think it was poor judgment?
Relatively small donations, no, I don't.
It was over $1,000, $32,000 over your life.
Well, that's over my life,
Well, over $1,000 while your nomination was pending. All right.
but not to one person. Most.
Oh,
of
no, no.
most
There
of
were
the
to a
contrib-
dozen senators, to a dozen different senators, including senators who've been critical of your nomination and senators who have not. You managed to cover the waterboard of Democrats running for office. All right, let's turn to another issue, which is you have been an active supporter of a left-wing activist group called Fight for the Future. And I will say the record of Fight for the Future is really quite remarkable because they have blasted members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. Here's a billboard Fight for the Future put up in West Virginia in 2017 attacking Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat. The billboard essentially accuses Joe Manchin of being corrupt. Ms. Sohn, do you believe Joe Manchin is corrupt?
Absolutely not.
You don't? Okay, well, that's interesting. I will point out, in 2017, Fight for the Future also erected similar billboards accusing Senator Tester and Senator Peters of being corrupt, both of whom are members of this committee. I can't recall a nominee who's actively supported efforts to blast members of this committee to run billboards.
Senator, may I address that, please?
You may.
When you say actively, I give every single organization with whom I work on net neutrality $100 contributions at the end of the year.
Ms. Sohn, with
Doesn't
respect,
mean I agree with their
respect,
tactics.
the time is limited, and yes, it does, because after they put up the billboards attacking Manchin, Tester, and Peters as corrupt, afterwards, you sent this tweet. Just made my end-of-year donation to this organization, urging others to do it after they did that. And because the time is limited, I'll note this group also blasted Marsha Blackburn, Dan Sullivan, and Roger Wicker, and astonishingly called for Chairwoman Cantwell to be fired. And after each of those, to be removed from as chairwoman of this committee, after each of those, you supported it. And in fact, I want to turn to the final point, the Roger Wicker one, where this group protested and said, You're buying a senator, and you said you don't support their tactics. I'm going to point out, you tweeted, "Well done," to this radical group who blasted the former ranking member of this committee and saying that his donors were trying to buy a senator. If they were trying to buy a senator, were you trying to buy senators when you made a dozen contributions?
Senator, I did not know, number one, that was about Senator Wicker. Number two, I was criticizing
It's
Senator.
Roger Wicker right there.
Okay, well,
that is literally what you retweeted was his name.
That's fine, but I was actually criticizing the donors and not criticizing the senator.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have known Gigi Sohn for 30 years. Ms. Sohn is one of the single most qualified candidates for any position to ever come before the Commerce Committee for confirmation. We knew that before Ms. Sohn testified before this committee in December of 2021 as President Biden's nominee for the FCC based on her decades of service protecting the public interest, that she had an outstanding record. And we certainly know that now, as Ms. Sohn comes before the committee for a third time, that her record is historically good. Since President Biden selected Ms. Sohn, she has become the subject of smears, double standards, and personal attacks. And let's be clear, it's not just Ms. Sohn who has suffered during this process. The American people have suffered as well, because in the time when telecommunications policy and broadband are more important than ever, the Federal Communications Commission, the expert agency, has been missing a commissioner. And without Ms. Sohn, the FCC has been unable to take critical steps to close the digital divide, make sure the internet remains free and open for everyone, protects consumers, and ends the homework gap once and for all for American children. So make no mistake, every day that Ms. Sohn goes without being on the FCC is a win for giant telecommunications companies and their army of lobbyists here in Washington, D.C. It is a loss for the American people. And why do the giant companies oppose Ms. Sohn? Because she believes in Darwinian, paranoia-inducing competition in the telecommunications field. She believes in consumer protections. Those giant incumbent companies want to change the name to incumbent communications companies. They don't believe in competition, and they don't believe in consumer protections. And that's why they don't want Gigi Sohn on the committee. So I would like to actually, for the record, introduce the 400 individuals and organizations who are supporting her for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I would like to turn to you, Ms. Sohn, with the remainder of my time and give you an opportunity to respond to any of the accusations that have already been made about you in this committee.
Yeah, I'd actually like to address something that Senator Thune talked about an alleged leak at the FCC. And what he's talking about was an Inspector General report, 2016, 7 years ago, where the Inspector General found that because Chairman Wheeler had authorized me to speak to the press about something that was non-public, that it became public. So there was no leak, and the Inspector General cleared everybody of wrongdoing. So I think it's really important to understand that when you're talking about my honesty and integrity, the IG report found no wrongdoing, and there was no leak. That is a meme that keeps getting repeated, and that just frankly drives me a little bit nuts. The other thing I wanted to discuss was back to the Locast case. The Locast case was never about money. Even before I joined the board in 2019, 2 months after the case was filed, the parties agreed that this case was not about piracy, that it was about whether Locast qualified for an exemption as a nonprofit under the copyright law. And that's why this case has never been about money. What the networks wanted and why they settled was because they wanted Locast gone. And that $32 million was just put in a public document in order to scare away the next Locast.
Meaning that they wanted to ensure that there was a deterrent to any other competitors that might want to get into the communication sector. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, so $32 million was what the plaintiffs could have gotten had we gone to trial, okay, and we appealed. We decided not to appeal, even though, frankly, the case was weak. The networks were delighted. In fact, they were pressuring us to settle because it was such a weak decision.
So you settled, or Locast settled because of the incumbent telecommunications companies that wanted to settle.
Yes, so, and that's the other thing. A settlement is an agreement between two parties. That's why I find it odd to call it a sweetheart deal. You're talking on one side about the most powerful networks, right? The 4 broadcast networks, and I think there were some other broadcasters as well, versus this little nonprofit that had a $2 million budget. I mean, it's a settlement. It's an agreement between two parties. It's not a sweetheart deal. I think the broadcasters got exactly what they wanted. Locast did not get what it wanted. Locast wanted to stay in business.
There are so many red herrings against your candidacy. We might have to put an aquarium here in the well of the committee to be able to accommodate them all. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just go back, because you mentioned something about this being a proxy fight over net neutrality, and it really isn't that. But we did go back. We restored in 2017, those rules were reversed. 6 years since then, broadband access has expanded and reached more rural areas, internet speeds have increased, there's more competition, creating more value to consumers here in the United States. And even in the UK, which imposed heavy-handed net neutrality regulations in 2016, they've moved to lessen its net neutrality regulations after seeing a decrease in broadband investment and not being able to meet consumers' demands through the course of the pandemic. So, you said, and I mean, your support for that is very clear. But the reason I don't think this is it's not a proxy on net neutrality, your nomination. I think what perhaps it is a proxy on is the partisanship with which you approach not only that issue, but every other issue. There was an attempt here on this committee to try and come up with a bipartisan agreement to deal with the issue of blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, all those sorts of things. And then the FCC under Chairman Wheeler, who was a very partisan FCC chairman, probably the most partisan in history, decided to go their own way. And so my question, I guess, having to do with that subject, because I want to get to one other issue that you mentioned, but let's just say, for example, that Congress were to decide to do something on this issue of blocking, for example. Do you believe that the FCC should come to Congress for more direction before attempting any iteration of net neutrality rules to prevent the back and forth between administrations, which is what we will see when administrations flip and the FCC changes majorities? You're going to get this back and forth, which creates no stability, no predictability, and completely undermines the conditions for investment if you want to continue to see the technology expand and grow. So I guess the question is, do you think that the FCC ought to come to Congress before you do something like that? Yes or no?
As Senator, I think I said this in both my prior hearings, I would love for Congress to give the FCC proper authority and specific authority to adopt net neutrality rules. Now, net neutrality has been repealed now for, we've been debating net neutrality for over 20 years, and Congress has not done so. And net neutrality was repealed, and authority, that's the most important thing I want to make clear, is that to me, the issue is not about blocking and throttling and paid prioritization. It's about whether an agency, which was created in 1934 to oversee communications networks, should have the power to oversee the most powerful communications network of our time. Congress has had 2 decades now to decide that authority, and it's refused to do so. However, I still believe Congress should do so, and I beg Congress to do so. But until then, until it does so, the
So
agency
if we
has got
came
to
up
have
with
authority.
something up here that, for example, legislation that would prevent blocking, but only blocking, would you support that? Yes or no?
As a partial solution, yes, but not as the entire solution.
All right, let's shift to the, as you'll likely recall, as part of a request I made to the FCC when serving as chairman of this committee, you were named, you mentioned this as being a source for a leak of confidential information that ultimately turned what could have been a bipartisan decision to adopt a cap for the Lifeline program into a partisan vote that left the program uncapped at the time. You recall this particular investigation. You said
Absolutely.
You do, yes or no? So is it correct that you did leak certain information about the FCC's Lifeline order to the press at the direction of then Chairman Wheeler? Yes or no?
It was not a leak. I will admit that I called Politico and told them that there was a deal, although I did not reveal the amount of the cap because Chairman Wheeler authorized me. And when he authorized me, as the IG says on the final page, that turned non-public information into public information. So at that point, it was no longer a leak.
Well, on the IG report, the point isn't that it was illegal, but that it blew up a bipartisan deal. So I want to come back to my original premise, and that is your activities at the FCC previous, everything that you've advocated since, including activity in political campaigns, which has already been alluded to, suggests that you would be a very partisan influence on a commission that, in my view, deals with issues where you need to try and find some consensus. What happened with the IG report, and I've got a copy of the IG report here, is that a deal which was in the throes of being made between the all five commissioners, Republicans and Democrats, was scuttled. And it was tanked. It was torpedoed by going public and trying to undermine that deal. That, to me, is, I think, the essence of what the IG report suggests. And I think it does get at the very heart of your qualifications as an FCC commissioner.
Yeah.
And I know I'm out of time, so I would just add one final point. And I said this before at a hearing last year, and that is the issues. There was an op-ed that Heidi Heitkamp, former senator, Democrat senator from North Dakota, submitted while your nomination was under consideration previously, in which she says someone is wrong for the FCC and rural America based on your comments, critical comments, about delivery of broadband in rural areas.
I'm going to let
Madam
Ms.
Chair,
Sohn respond to that. Thank you quickly, and then we're going to Senator Klobuchar.
So just two things really quickly. Chairman Wheeler, and it's in the IG report, would have gone along with that vote. The only reason that I was asked to call Politico was because the meeting kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed, and we were just being inundated with calls, okay? So Wheeler actually would have done anything that Commissioner Clyburn would have asked to do. So that's number one. Number two, on the Heitkamp point, I'm supported by, as you saw, Chad Roop, former RUS administrator for the Trump administration, Hilda Gay-Legg, former RUS administrator for the Bush administration, and TCA, the Rural Broadband Association, WTA, Rural Broadband Advocates, and the Rural Wireless Association. And that's because I believe they need better broadband, and I'm absolutely a huge supporter. What I have criticized and what Senator Heitkamp took way out of context was a speech that I gave that said that the federal government had not done a good enough job with the $50 billion it had over a decade in getting rural broadband to America. So she took what I said completely out of context. I'm a huge supporter of rural broadband, and my supporters prove it.
Thank you.
Madam
Senator,
Chair, the IG report, the whole point was to scuttle a bipartisan deal on Lifeline.
Senator Klobuchar.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Sohn. Let's take off on the broadband issue, which is so big to so many of us, especially those of us with rural areas. We know the FCC is responsible, one of the key agencies responsible for the rollout of the bipartisan infrastructure law. How does the lack of a full commission, which has been going on for way too long, ultimately affect consumers who need reliable, affordable internet access?
Well, it affects them in a myriad of different ways. I mean, first, and this is one of my frustrations of not having been confirmed yet, is I would love to be able to help the FCC ensure that they have the most accurate broadband map that they can possibly have. Now, I can't fix it myself, but I have unbelievable relationships with the states, including many of the states of folks that sit on this dais, and I would love to help improve that broadband map. And without an accurate broadband map, the money that is going to be spent by the Commerce Department is not going to go to the right places. And this is not to criticize the FCC. I think they're doing the best they can with what they have. But I could be an enormous help in that regard. There are many other things. I'll stop there.
Okay. I want to turn to something else I care a lot about, and I think you and I have talked about this before, and that's 911 centers. An estimated 240 million calls are made to 911 centers annually. However, often they are relying on outdated technologies. In many places, it doesn't even support text messages, which is how so many people are going to contact 911. Can you speak to the importance of upgrading 911 systems? I'm one of the chairs of the 911 caucus. I've always cared a lot about this issue. And if confirmed, could you talk about what you think needs to be done?
Yeah, look, there's nothing more important that the FCC does that ensures that the public is safe. And when I was at the FCC with Chairman Wheeler, we actually started the proceeding that kind of got kicked off NG 911. And that's why public safety officials and NENA, which is the 911 Association, support my confirmation. So I would want to improve NG 911 if I am confirmed, and certainly ensure that it works properly in rural areas, because I know that is a problem.
Okay. Speaking of something else that you've touched on before about rural areas, and that is back to the broadband issue. In rural areas of my state, about 16% of households lack access at even baseline speeds. And could you talk about your plans after this bill has been passed for achieving universal access to broadband, specifically in rural communities?
Yes, thanks, Senator. What I believe deeply is that the FCC needs to work very, very closely with the NTIA to ensure that really over $47 billion that the broadband infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure law has put out for broadband deployment is well spent. And that the states have the wherewithal to spend that money wisely, because what we don't want is to come back in 5 years and say, wow, we spent $47 billion and we still have huge swaths of America, of rural America, and frankly, urban America, that don't have adequate broadband. So I think the FCC needs to be a partner with the NTIA in implementing the terms of the infrastructure law and making sure that that money is spent, the taxpayer money is spent wisely and effectively. Thank you.
One of the issues that have come up over the years is the mapping, and maps have been a serious problem. I know you know that. The Broadband Data Act, which I led with Senators Wicker and Peters and Thune, is focused on improving the FCC's data collection process to get more accurate maps. It was signed into law in March of 2020. Talk about how you're going to be able to focus on maps, if confirmed, to the areas that are served or unserved.
Senator, I'll make this vow to everybody in this room and on this dais. If I am confirmed, the first thing I am going to do is offer my assistance to the chairwoman to do anything that it takes to make those maps as accurate as possible. So when NTIA gives out that money or allocates that money on June 30th, we have the best map possible in the time that we have. Now, the map is iterative and it's going to keep getting better, but that June 30th date is a really, really critical date. And that's why time is really of the essence to get me confirmed, because if I don't get confirmed at all, there's not going to be a fifth person on the FCC in time to do anything about those maps. So I care deeply about this issue because I worked really, really hard on the broadband provisions of the infrastructure law. I was the person who sold it to the public interest community. It was not everything that the public interest community wanted, but I thought it was important because it was bipartisan and it was a lot of money. and it could do a lot of good, and I'd like to continue that.
Thank you. Senator Peters.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Sohn, well, certainly thank you for appearing before the committee now a third time. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to further discuss both your priorities and my priorities and how the FCC can best serve Americans. First question is related to auto safety. And as chairman of the Surface Transportation Subcommittee, I'm focused on improving safety on our roadways. Nearly 43,000 people died on our roads in 2021, the largest year-over-year increase since we began collecting records. And many of these deaths are avoidable if we facilitate broad deployment of roadway safety technologies like CV2S, which basically stands for Cellular Vehicle to Everything technology. And that's why state departments of transportation, industry, safety groups, and academia have all lined up to ask the FCC to grant waivers to allow the deployment of this life-saving technology, which among other things can enable vehicles to see around corners beyond visual line of sight, provide safety warnings at blind intersections, alert driver to poor road conditions, or active school or work zones. Previous studies have estimated that deploying this technology could eliminate or mitigate the severity of more than 80% of light vehicle crashes. Deployment will also keep us from falling behind other nations that are already integrating this technology into their infrastructure. And that's why yesterday, Senator Lummis and I sent a letter to the FCC urging it to take action to grant these waivers and move forward on this technology within the auto safety spectrum. Madam Chair Cantwell, I would, without objection, like to submit the bipartisan letter. Thank you. So, Ms. Sohn, my question to you is, do you agree that it's important for Americans that we protect auto safety spectrum and deploy safety technologies like CV2X on American roadways?
Absolutely, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Second, as you know, in 2020, Congress passed the Secure and Trusted Communications Act to ensure that American broadband networks were free from the influence of Chinese state-connected companies like Huawei and ZTE. In that bill, Congress promised broadband providers that we would help them pay and, quote, rip and replace this equipment. So my first question is to you. Do you agree with the Secure and Trusted Communications Act that it is critical to our national security to eliminate Chinese state-connected technologies from U.S. networks?
Yes, sir, and I also agree with former Commissioner O'Reilly that it is underfunded right now and needs more money.
Well, that leads the next question. Certainly, securing the networks is essential, and that's why I've been disappointed by Congress' failure to close the rip and replace funding shortfall that rural providers are facing as they try to remove Huawei and other equipment from their broadband networks. Ms. Sohn, the first time you were before this committee, we talked about the importance of supporting innovative broadband solutions like Northern Michigan University's Educational Access Network in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And now that very network and the communities that it serves are basically being held hostage by a $27 million funding shortfall to carry out this rip and replace mandate. As Michigan's representative here in Congress and in the Senate, I'm committed to getting this funding, of course, across the finish line. But my question for you as an FCC commissioner, would you commit to working with the Hill and rural broadband providers to ensure that they are supported throughout this critical process to secure our networks?
Yes, sir, and in fact, I just met with a bunch of members of the Rural Wireless Association who talked to me about their concerns of invoices not getting paid for rip and replace. So I have a great relationship with those broadband providers, and yes, I absolutely will work with them.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Fisher, and I apologize, she should have been next before, so thank you for your indulgence. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is now the third time that Ms. Sohn has come before the committee. She's given dismissive and evasive answers and outright flipped on positions she had otherwise consistently taken throughout her career. I continue to have serious concerns about the nominee's record. She has troubling conflicts of interest, which prompted her second appearance before the committee last year. She was a leading board member of Locast, a company that pirated content from local broadcasters. A federal court issued an injunction against her company from operating this illegal scheme. Ms. Sohn tried to do damage control in our hearings. She eventually promised to recuse herself from certain proceedings at the FCC if confirmed. I believe this promise essentially admitted to conflicts of interest on matters such as retransmission consent and television copyrights. But her recusal was non-binding and vaguely construed. Her answers to hearing questions also showed no regret for her actions. She even downplayed the situation by emphasizing that Locast was just a nonprofit, framing the company as if it were a charity. It is not. The FCC is charged with protecting intellectual property rights. Copyright protections are the lifeblood of local broadcasters. But Ms. Sohn thinks she's some kind of copyright Robin Hood. She told this very committee that she thought she was helping broadcasters while she was, in fact, stealing their content. It's incredible. Locast wasn't the first copyright controversy centered around Ms. Sohn. She also championed the FCC's failed set-top box order while she was a senior advisor at the commission. That order received major blowback for the lack of transparency around its drafting and circulation as well. I previously questioned Ms. Sohn about transparency concerns, such as why she bragged on a public panel about concealing another controversial order as a senior FCC advisor. Then there was the Inspector General report, which I would say found that she did leak confidential documents to the press while employed at the FCC. Her actions purposely derailed a bipartisan agreement to reform the Lifeline program. I'm certain we will only see more of this partisan deceptive conduct if the Senate moves this nomination forward. The FCC's mission rests on advancing communications in ways that serve the public interest. I'm afraid Ms. Sohn and I have very different outlooks about what's in the public interest. I cannot support a nominee who would put rural broadband access on the back burner. I cannot support a nominee who has willfully jeopardized local broadcast stations. I cannot support a nominee who would oversee public safety communications but has amplified rhetoric to defund the police. And I cannot support a nominee who has a record of acting unethically while working at the very agency to which she is nominated. I voted for Democratic FCC nominees in the past, including Chairman Rosenworcel and Chairman Stark and Commissioner Starks. I do not agree with all of their positions, but they were qualified and they were not driven by bias. This nomination has turned into a spectacle because of the nominee's own record and actions. I will not support a partisan nominee, and I urge the administration to withdraw the nomination. At the previous two hearings, I have asked the nominee questions, and I have no additional questions at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Next, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Sohn, did you have something you wanted to respond to?
Well, it might take up the full 5 minutes. I would like an opportunity to respond to Senator Fisher.
I asked no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Ms. Sohn, opponents to your nomination continue to classify your support of net neutrality as, quote, extreme, end quote. Ms. Sohn, do a majority of Republican and Democratic voters support net neutrality?
By overwhelming margins.
So a majority of Americans, Democratic voters, Republican voters, independents, believe net neutrality is needed. Now, to me, that's the opposite of extreme. We should ensure internet providers are common carriers and prohibited from prioritizing or discriminating lawful content on their networks. Ms. Sohn, you have a strong record of defending free speech and viewpoints from across the aisle. At the FCC and as a public interest advocate for decades, you have continuously fought for the rights of both conservative and liberal voices. Yes or no, do you commit to upholding and promoting the free speech rights of all Americans?
Absolutely.
Can you reiterate for this committee some of the endorsements you've received from organizations across the spectrum?
Sure. Organizations include Newsmax, the president of OAN. These are two of the most conservative cable networks on the planet, and I've received some blowback on the left from that. Parents Television Council, which is a very conservative organization that fights to keep obscenity and indecency off broadcasting. I have support from Preston Padden, as we talked before, who was a former Fox News lobbyist, Chad Roop, Hilda Gay Legg, Daniel Linville of West Virginia, who is as conservative as you can get. He's a West Virginia legislator.
So I'm going to interject here. I didn't realize the list was so long.
It's longer.
What I'll ask is that you submit them into the record so that we have them for the record as
Absolutely.
well. Now, Ms. Sohn, we've gone over 2 years without a full commission at the FCC. The cost to the American public for this vacancy has been extreme. The FCC is charged with overseeing some of the most critical sectors of the American economy, media and communications. These are massive industries that are also on the verge of receiving a historic amount of public funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The FCC is the lawful regulator and enforcement agency for the federal government's effort to fight against robocalls and to ensure consumers have a voice on their side when they have an issue with their cable, cell, or broadband provider. Every second we wait, to me, the worse it gets. Can you please discuss the cost this long-term vacancy has had on American consumers?
Yes, Senator Lujan, you actually mentioned some of them early on in your opening statement. One that really comes to mind is the fact that a $200 million penalty against some wireless carriers who sold personal information to data brokers who then sold them to bounty hunters. And those bounty hunters find people that don't want to be found, including domestic violence victims. They cannot vote that out because they don't have a third vote. I mean, this is a no-brainer. Similarly, now there've been at least 3 major reports about carriers who lied, flat out lied, and admitted finally that they lied about where they provide service. The FCC cannot, they cannot do anything to try to deter that kind of conduct. So the enforcement mechanism of the FCC, when it comes to things like that, really is almost shut down. But other things they can't do are extend E-rate funding to classrooms, fix or do anything with regard to the media ownership rules, fix the Universal Service Fund, which is something that a lot of people on this dais want to happen. So and of course, they can't reinstate the authority to oversee broadband and impose net neutrality rules.
I appreciate that. And in my opening, I failed to ask for unanimous consent to offer a 6th letter into the record, the smear campaign against FCC nominee Gigi Sohn, written by Preston Padden, who's the former president of ABC Television Network and a founding executive of Fox Broadcasting Title. So I'd ask unanimous consent to offer this into the record, and if there is no objection, it's allowed. With that, I will call on our next senator, Senator Vance.
All right, Senator Lujan, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Sohn, thank you for coming before us today. So I want to take my line of questioning a slightly different direction from some of the other folks, and I think just to be direct with you, Ms. Sohn, there are actually areas of substantive agreement between the two of us on some of these issues. But I also notice that you are a participant in what I would call this weird racialization of American political rhetoric in the last few years. And in particular, I think coming out of a desire to give equal opportunity and fairness to every American, regardless of skin color, that's of course a very good thing. There's been this weird trend in certain corners of American politics to be very, very racialized and even to criticize explicit racial groups almost as a pejorative. And you unfortunately have participated in that. And I want to ask just a couple of questions on that. Before I do, I want to illustrate this by pointing out something that's going on in my state. We have a very, very bad train crash in East Palestine, Ohio. It's caused a terrible chemical spill, likely environmental consequences as far as the eye can see. And of course, we're doing as much as we can to help constituents on the ground. But I note that Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg yesterday when he made some public remarks, instead of commenting on this or talking about the issue or giving any reason to think that he's focused on one of the major transportation mishaps in this country over the last couple of years, he decided to instead focus on the terrible scourge of too many white men in the construction industry. And I find that preposterous, both on its own face, but also as a focus from the Secretary of Transportation. So I want to read you a tweet with that backdrop in mind. And I quote, "President Obama is a raggedy black supremacist president, and his cowardly enablers would rather kill everybody than stop killing white people." Do you think a person who said that should be appointed or confirmed to the FCC?
Could you read, I didn't quite get that. Could you just reread that, would you mind?
President Obama is a raggedy black supremacist president, and his cowardly enablers would rather kill everybody than stop killing white people. Do you think a person, yes or no, who says that should be appointed to the FCC?
I would need to know more of the context, honestly.
Okay, well, I think
can't really
clearly a
answer the
person who said that should not be appointed to the FCC. And in fact, you retweeted the exact same thing, only with President Trump instead of President Obama, and the races reversed. Let me read another tweet, and let me ask you if this is an acceptable thing for an FCC commissioner. "Angry black woman, not a good look, Judge Brown Jackson." Would a person who tweeted that pejoratively be deserving of the position that you're seeking?
I think it has nothing to do with the position that they're seeking, so not necessarily.
So I think that's
I know I tweeted something about
come
Judge
on.
Kavanaugh, right?
I think that's preposterous. Come on. You tweeted at Judge Kavanaugh, "Angry white man, not a good look, Judge Kavanaugh." Now, here's why I think that it's relevant. We live in a country that's very diverse. People come from very different backgrounds. And one of the things that preserves what little racial comedy and harmony we have in this country is that our leaders don't use that racial comedy and harmony like a toddler who discovered their daddy's gun. You talk about racial issues in a way that will inflame the very worst things in our country. And I fear that if you're given this position of authority, you will use that authority to continue to inflame and to continue potentially even to censor based on some of these ideas. Now, I've just illustrated a couple of ways that we talk about these issues, or some of our leaders talk about these issues. I hope that I never do. And if I do, I hope my constituents will hold me to account for it. But one of the things that I fear here is that you're being appointed to a position with an incredible amount of control over the way that we communicate with each other, the way that we debate with each other, the way that our politics actually manifests itself in the public debate. And I guess I'd ask you, do you think those comments are a good thing for the American people to hear, given how much power you will have if you get confirmed?
Senator, I made those comments in my role as either a private citizen or a public advocate, and they will have absolutely no bearing on how I would act as an FCC commissioner.
Ms. Sohn, I appreciate that, but they reveal something about how you see the world, how you think about the world, and how you feel about the world. So I understand and respect that you made them in your capacity as a private citizen, but they are reflective of a person who will have a lot of power if the Senate confirms your nomination. And this is why I'm going to oppose your nomination, despite some areas of substantive agreement. Thank you, Ms. Sohn.
Senator, if I could just say, I can't just walk into the FCC and say, okay, Gigi Sohn wants all these things to happen and they will happen. Okay, first of all, I'm not going to be the chair, and let's put that one on the table and put that to bed, because that's the latest K Street rumor, right? That the White House wants to make me the chair. That's false. Okay, you have to, as an FCC commissioner, you have to follow the law. You have to follow the Administrative Procedure Act. There's a procedure before you. You have to follow the record. You have to meet with stakeholders. You can't just willy-nilly make a decision based on what your predilections are. And if I were to do that, well, first of all, I'd have to get 2 other votes, unlikely. But if that were to happen, a court could reverse it, because you have to follow process. And I think it's really important for people who think that I'm some sort of Svengali who could just walk into the FCC and make it bend to my will, that I can't do that under the law.
Ms. Soto, I appreciate that, and I appreciate that we have a constitution and we have certain procedures we have to follow. Of course, I'm one of 100 senators, and I can't walk into this body and make things exactly as I want them. The point is not that you'll have complete power over the FCC. The point is that we live in a country that is undergoing a series of very toxic movements in the way that we talk about one another. And I think in particular, the racial dialogue, the racial rhetoric that you've used is disqualifying. Whether you have a lot of power or a little power, I don't think it's what we need in our public administrators. I yield the rest of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we'll hear from Senator Rosen. Senator Rosen?
Well, thank you, Senator Lujan. Appreciate you recognizing me, and I really appreciate today's hearing. But before I begin my questions, I'd like to echo concerns raised about the nominees' positions on matters of importance for law enforcement, both nationally and in Nevada. Law enforcement groups have expressed serious concerns about Ms. Sohn's membership on the board of a digital privacy organization that has strongly advocated against law enforcement access to digital evidence needed to hold criminals accountable and to protect the public. Also of concern to law enforcement are allegations that the nominee has expressed support for movements aligned with defunding the police, or at the very least, defunding police surveillance tools, again needed to keep our community safe. These are questions that have already been raised by other members of the committee today, so I'm not going to elaborate further, but I will note that such concerns by law enforcement do give me pause. I would like to use my time today to touch on an issue of critical importance to Nevadans: rural access to broadband. And so we want to close that digital divide, particularly in our rural frontier communities, and Nevada's goal of bringing affordable, reliable broadband across the state by 2029 is essential, absolutely essential to supporting our state's needs. As we saw during the pandemic, broadband is critical when connecting to school, to work, healthcare, to our friends, to our family. And now more than ever, we must make sure that Americans have access to reliable and affordable broadband. That's why I'm proud to have led many efforts on this subject, like my Middle Mile Broadband Deployment Act, which was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law and will help our communities get better connected. So, Ms. Sohn, as you know, mountains, deserts, valleys, we have it all. We have challenging terrain in Nevada, and it often separates rural and tribal areas from other communities with more broadband access. So if confirmed, how will you address these challenges to close the digital divide by bringing high quality and affordable broadband to all Americans, no matter where they live, even in these remote rural communities?
Thank you, Senator Rosen, and I hope you will give me an opportunity to address the law enforcement issue, because I think it's critically important, and I think my positions have been grossly misstated, and my position on the EFF board also grossly misstated. So I hope you'll give me that opportunity with a meeting or at this hearing to talk about that, because it's really important that we get the record straight. But let me address your main question, because as you may know, I've had several conversations with Brian Mitchell, who is the head of the broadband office in Nevada, and we've talked at length about the concerns that Brian has in particular and the state has with the maps. And as I said before, and I've seen your letter with Senator Cortez Masto expressing concern about the maps. And I'd really would love the opportunity to be at the FCC to try to make that map as good as possible before NTIA has to allocate its money on June 30th. So to me, there's nothing more important right now than getting that money spent wisely and getting those maps right.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate that. I'm just going to really quickly, I just have a minute left, and I know we're in the middle of a vote, but I just want to talk about connecting small businesses, because 99% of businesses in Nevada are small businesses. We're on the forefront of emerging technologies: electric vehicles, blockchain, autonomous vehicles, lithium batteries. We're just doing it all. And as these enterprises continue to make significant investments in my state, we need to be sure that small businesses have the support these innovative companies, the suppliers, contractors, the vendors, all the way that they have the digital tools and the broadband access they need. And so I know I just have a few seconds left, so I just want to say how you said you're speaking with Nevada and others. How should the FCC work with federal agencies, including our Economic Development Agency and our Small Business Administration, to be sure that small businesses like those up and down my state are participating in internet-connected economy and have good access?
Yes, I think it's critical that the FCC work with any and all agency, coordinate with those agencies, whether it be the Department of Agriculture, the Small Business Administration, the Department of Commerce. Those relationships are critically important to make sure that everybody gets connected and to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts. I think that's also very important. There's concern, frankly, from a lot of Republicans and conservatives, Senator Thune has left, about the fact that there are so many different agencies that have some sort of stake in broadband that we may be duplicating efforts. And I think it's incumbent on the leadership of those agencies to get together quite often to make sure that that's not happening.
Well, thank you. I look forward to seeing streamlining in so many of our agencies to get the job done for our constituents. I see my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. And Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sohn, thank you for your time yesterday, and thank you for being with us again. A couple of things I want to discuss that I didn't get to yesterday. In your past careers, you've made it your job to go after certain companies in the telecom industry, and you've particularly been harsh with internet service providers. And in 2019, you tweeted, and I'm quoting the tweet, "Big tech companies are under enormous scrutiny while big telecom and cable and deregulated and consolidated. What's missing is the enormous amount of money big telecom and cable are spending to ensure that the focus stays on tech and not them." Even in your testimony that you submitted to us, you suggest that regulated entities are the ones making false and misleading attacks, and I'm quoting you there, on your record because they fear you, your choice of terms. So how can we believe you will be impartial if an issue involving any of these companies comes before you as a commissioner?
Now, first, I would say that every single industry player who I've criticized, I've also worked with. And not long before I got nominated, I worked closely with Verizon and Comcast and AT&T to get the emergency broadband benefit, to get a letter together to support the emergency broadband benefit. So I've worked with these companies. And as I said to Senator Vance, a proceeding at the FCC is constrained. You have to follow the record, decide based on the record, using the procedures outlining the Administrative Procedure Act.
And yes, let me ask you about that and where you're going with that response. And I saw your response to Senator Vance. So if you're leaning into this component that your background, as you say in your testimony, your background as an advocate, your choice of words there, and you suggest that that is what makes you a good commissioner. That is going to help make you a good commissioner. If being an advocate is what positions you to do this job, then why should we think you would act differently in this job when you were a commissioner?
Well, because as a policy, I know that the role of a policymaker is different than the role of an advocate. And just let me also say, I really only asked to be treated like other nominees for the FCC. We've had nominees for the FCC, including my former boss, who worked for two industries, and he was a very, very fervent advocate for his industries. Chairman Pai worked for Verizon, and I'm sure he was a very fervent advocate for Verizon. So I'm just
okay,
asking
then-
to be treated the same way, Senator.
Okay, let's look at it a different way. You were named a top lobbyist by The Hill in 2012 and 2013. So do you consider yourself a lobbyist or do you consider yourself an advocate?
I haven't been registered as a lobbyist for years, and that just, in fact, I was registered as a lobbyist very briefly, but
Okay.
when I ran public knowledge, I stopped going to the Hill, so it didn't make any sense. And that Hill lobbyist, best lobbyist, doesn't mean that you are registered as a lobbyist. It just means you're a good advocate. So I was very proud
Okay.
of that distinction.
All right, I checked on the number of filings that you signed your name to at the FCC. And filings and proceedings, it was nearly 150 that you had signed your name to. You said you will voluntarily recuse yourself from some broadcast issues if confirmed. However, you also participated in proceedings on many other topics ranging from net neutrality to universal service and intercarrier compensation. Once again, as we look at this, whether the work is as an advocate or a lobbyist or a term you've discounted, activist, should you be recusing yourself from all of this variety of issues that are going to come about, issues you've previously signed your name to filings and proceedings? Would you be recusing yourself from all of those?
Yes, Senator, I addressed this quite at length in the February 9th hearing, and I'll just repeat myself. My voluntary recusal was an attempt to address the concerns, and we heard them again today, that people had over my participation on the Sports Fan Coalition New York board, which ran Lowcast.
Yeah.
So I voluntarily recused myself at the nexus of the work I had done previously at the FCC, not at the FCC, as an advocate working at the FCC, and the Lowcast board. Okay, so that's why I voluntarily recused, to address those specific concerns. What you're asking for is not tethered to anything other than just every single issue out there. And again, I just want to
No, I would
disagree.
disagree with that. These are tethered to statements you've agreed with and filings that you have signed your name to. So it is relevant. I see my time is over, but
Thank you.
this does have an impact. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for appearing again in front of the Commerce Committee. Your perseverance is admirable, and particularly in light of the attacks that have been made against your character. It was clear after your first hearing that you're qualified to serve as a commissioner of the FCC. It was also clear after your second hearing that you are well qualified to serve as a commissioner of the FCC. And I am every bit as confident that it will be as clear by the end of the day today at your third hearing that you're qualified and ready to serve for the FCC. People across my state look forward to your confirmation and to the FCC having a full complement of commissioners to tackle truly important issues, including rural broadband deployment, support for local news and television, and advancing digital equity. Last time you appeared before this committee, I noted the historic nature of your nomination and how important it was for the country to see LGBTQ people, whether they are senators or soon-to-be FCC commissioners, in prominent roles while being their true selves. Like I said then, being first is not always easy, but millions of people across the country, including myself, are grateful for you continuing to pave the way for LGBTQ people who want to serve their country.
Thank you.
I want to turn to a couple of questions here on specific matters. I was honored to lead the bipartisan National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, which transitioned the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline into an easy-to-remember 3-digit code, 988, to better serve people in crisis situations. I was disturbed to learn recently that there was a nearly day-long outage of the 988 hotline back in December, and that it was a result of a cyber attack. While FCC has since proposed regulations to bring 988 outage reporting requirements in line with 911 outage reporting requirements, I'm concerned that the 988 lifeline remains vulnerable to cyber attacks, or which would prevent people in crisis from getting the help they need. What more can the FCC or Congress do to improve the resiliency of 988 and 911 services?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I've always thought that the FCC should play a larger role in ensuring that our networks are secure and resilient. The chairwoman has done some good work with regard to mobile networks, but I think we need to do more, and I think the FCC needs to have a more active role, and if Congress would like to give it a more active role, that would be great, to oversee the cybersecurity practices of ISPs.
Okay. I believe that there's tremendous value in consumers having access to relevant local news and programming. In a world in which we can increasingly seek out our sources that simply tell us what we want to hear, local media can provide timely, trustworthy information that helps Wisconsinites and others connect with their communities and neighbors. That's why Senator Markey and I last week reintroduced the Protecting Community Television Act to support funding for public education and government, or PEG, channels. Thousands of Wisconsinites rely on these channels to get news and other programming rooted in their own communities, and in-kind contributions play an important role in those services. Ms. Sohn, from your experience as a consumer advocate, do you agree that local media is important, including for improving our national discourse? And if confirmed to the Commission, what could the FCC do to better support these PEG channels?
Yes, that's a great question. Look, I believe that local media, whether it be broadcasting or PEG channels, are really sort of the bulwark against some of the partisanship that we've been talking about today. And I'll even admit that some of my tweets have been sharp, and I've admitted it before, you know, this country has changed a lot since 2016, let's just face it. I did not like the FCC's decision to include in-kind contributions as part of the 5% of the cable fee. And I would support if the chairwoman were to start a proceeding to reverse that. If the records show that that was a thing to do, my inclination would be to reverse that decision, because I think it's important. It's amazing how many people watch PEG. You don't think it, right? You see it, and you see these basic, these very basic channels with basic entertainment, but people watch it. So it's critically important because people do want to know what's going on in their community. And I think the FCC is tasked by law to promote that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Budd.
I thank the chair. Ms. Sohn, welcome back to the committee. Good to see you. Enjoyed our conversation last week. So my constituents in North Carolina, they support law enforcement and they want safer communities. Many live, work, and raise their families in those rural communities. Bridging the digital divide and getting access to every American has long been a bipartisan interest and an important job for the FCC. In written congressional testimony, you claim that, quote, policymakers have focused disproportionately on broadband deployment in rural areas, end quote. Residents of North Carolina know that improving internet access in rural areas keeps these smaller communities thriving. We need an FCC that's focused on bridging the digital divide in North Carolina and prioritizing the economic and educational benefits of better broadband. It's also concerning that law enforcement groups like the National Sheriff's Association and the Fraternal Order of Police oppose your nomination. You're listed as a board member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, and since your nomination, you've tried to minimize the significance of your board seat, but being a board member is no small thing. EFF has called you a close collaborator for nearly 20 years. You've donated to them and made public calls for others to donate to EFF. In a letter to this committee, the Fraternal Order of Police stated that you have an anti-police bias. and refused to disavow many extreme positions from EFF. In the summer of 2020, as rioters burned businesses across the country, EFF encouraged folks to go to the streets, even publishing a memo on how to thwart law enforcement investigations, suggesting people buy a prepaid disposable phone and dress for anonymity. Chair, I'd like to submit this to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Now, the FCC and law enforcement, they work together a lot, as we know. And as you know, the FCC makes sure that law enforcement alerts are delivered over communications networks and that those networks can comply with court orders to aid in law enforcement investigations. Your deep association with the anti-law enforcement views of the EFF leads me to believe that your confirmation would, as the Fraternal Order of Police wrote, quote, show a complete disregard for the hardworking men and women of law enforcement, end quote. Ms. Sohn, you've taken to social media to express your anti-police bias. For example, you have retweeted and liked statements supporting defund the police. You've also retweeted a statement referring to federal law enforcement officers responding to riots in 2020 as, quote, armed goons in riot gear with tear gas, end quote, as Senator Cruz mentioned in his opening remarks. Ms. Sohn, given your demonstrated anti-police bias, do you understand why law enforcement officers don't trust you to look out for their best interest, especially if you help lead an agency that's a critical partner of law enforcement? Yes or no?
Senator,
and just simply yes or no, please.
Could you repeat the question, because I kind of lost?
Yeah, the question's really based on your understanding of why law enforcement's concerned. I mean, do you understand why law enforcement has concern, yes or no?
No, I don't, actually.
You actually don't. Okay, so that's actually
I'm very
telling
surprised.
Thank you. I do want to reclaim my time here. So, I mean, it's obvious why they would be concerned with these tweets and retweets and the things that you would support. But Ms. Sohn, the EFF published a guide called Attending a Protest that tells people to wear a mask. It will protect you from being identified in photos of the protest. Ms. Sohn, does encouraging folks to hide their identity during violent situations make law enforcement's job easier? Yes or no, simply?
I don't consider protests necessarily violent, sir. Look, I don't make policy.
Well, during violent situations, as we saw in 2020, do you understand why law enforcement would have a concern with you suggesting that people enhance their anonymity? Yes or no?
I understand why people might not want to be surveilled. I understand that. But I had nothing to do with...
So I was hoping for a yes or no that you could actually understand law enforcement's concern.
I understand, I absolutely understand.
So you do understand
Yes.
law enforcement's concern. Thank you.
I do, yes.
Ms. Sohn, you know, we can learn a lot by who a person associates with, and you've been associated with a lot of radical partisans. You're an EFF board member and have received support from a group, 18 Million Rising, which has said, quote, policing has never been an effective response to violence because police are agents of white supremacy, end quote. The FCC needs impartial leadership, and unfortunately, I don't believe that you offer that. I fear that your confirmation would make it harder for law enforcement to protect North Carolinians and make it harder for my state's many rural communities to get desperately needed broadband. I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to oppose your nomination. And again, thank you for being here. I yield back.
Can I respond?
Yes, go ahead,
Yeah.
quickly. Yes.
Just a couple of things. First of all, my tweets and retweets are about as banal and basic as you can imagine. Police brutality is bad. Militarization of police. Again, this is not me speaking, it's just likes and retweets. The Alexandria Ocasio tweet or retweet that I did was because she was explaining what she meant by defund the police. I actually personally feel that the defund the police term is stupid and it's been counterproductive. That's the only reason I retweeted that. I do not support defunding the police.
Madam Chair, I just want to be clear, I did yield back my time. Thank you.
I thank the senator. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let me just say first that I've always respected and worked with law enforcement ever since I was in law school. In fact, I just did a walkthrough in my neighborhood 2 weeks ago with the police. So I'm really baffled by this opposition. It's the Fraternal Order of Police's biggest concern is EFF's encryption position, which, by the way, the FCC has no jurisdiction over, and I've not spoken about it. I mean, it's similar with the FOSTA SESTA. I've not spoken about these things. These are not, I care about FCC stuff, and this is not FCC stuff. So
Senator Welch.
I think it's a bit overwrought, to be honest with you.
Senator Welch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two real concerns. One is that we get rural broadband broadly and effectively deployed. Number two, that we have an effective functioning FCC. And that requires, number one, that we do have some bipartisanship on this committee. Every one of us represents rural areas. My Republican colleagues in many cases have more rural areas than we do. Mapping is critical to that. And our understanding in Vermont is that the mapping is overstating the coverage. That's been the case for some time. We have been asking that there not be a distribution of money until we have confidence that the mapping is solid. What say you about the mapping and what you'll do to make certain that before we act on the deployment, we have accurate maps to guarantee that folks in rural areas, the last barn on the dirt road in Vermont, has access to high-speed internet?
So, Senator, two things. You probably know that I recently spoke with Christine Hallquist, who's the head of the broadband office in Vermont, and my wife and I have a very close relationship, having had our civil union there. So we love the state. And yes, I agree with you 100%. It is critical to get those maps as accurate as possible by June 30th. And I would dedicate myself to doing it if I could get confirmed.
Well, if we don't have accurate maps, we've got to wait until we do get them.
Yes, so.
And there's a tension between getting the money out the door and getting it out the door in a way that is going to be effectively utilized, right?
Without a doubt. There's a huge tension, and I understand why the Commerce Department wants to get that, wants to get the money out. I don't think they're going to change, so that's why I think it's important to get somebody in there now who's going to work their tail off to try to get those maps as accurate as possible.
All right.
But let me
go on to another question. You know, Senator Thune brought up, I think, a very fair concern, and that is, will the commission work with the Congress to do things where there's a bipartisan path forward? And my understanding of the distinction between what you said and what he was concerned about is a leak versus you were authorized. So I'm going to take you that is what you were doing, something you thought was fully authorized. But in the spirit of what Senator Thune was asking, can you pledge as a commissioner that you will do your level best to work with Congress in an effort to get to the bipartisan approach that we need in order to get rural broadband in all of our communities?
Absolutely, and I did play, as a public advocate, I played a very large role in working both with Republicans and Democrats to get that bill passed.
Right, and the third is a point I want to make. Madam Chair, there's a real dilemma for rural America, and the dilemma is that the big cable companies and the big telecom companies have a business model that is very much oriented towards making money, which is easier to do in the dense urban populations, and they're leaving us in the rural areas behind. And that's true whether you're Senator Schmidt with Missouri or you're in rural Northeast Kingdom, Vermont. And we have in Vermont community union districts, and those have been empowered with local authority to make decisions where they're on the hook to make certain that that farmer at the end of the dirt road has high-speed internet. That's the objective, not maximizing the profit. Is that a model that you see as being helpful to guarantee that rural folks with not much economic clout are going to get what they absolutely need?
Yeah, I love that model. And in fact, the infrastructure law requires the states to confer with local communities. And if they're not doing that, that's something that NTIA needs to look and make sure that is happening. Okay, so the local communities are on the front lines of knowing who has broadband, what they need, what the community needs. So they must work with the state level folks who are giving out the money.
Well, I'm having more confidence in Vermont that if we do this right, the money actually is going to make a difference for those folks in rural America. And I don't think we did the job that we needed to do in the past round of funding. So I wish you luck. Thank you for being here, and I yield back.
You have great leadership in Vermont, so I agree with you. I think you will get good
Thank
bargain
you.
there.
Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, and welcome back, I suppose. My first time with you, but I did want to touch on a couple of issues maybe that have not been addressed yet. The FCC, as you know, has an important role in the lives of Americans. It is an independent agency, of course, with the stated mission of overseeing and improving our communication system. But beyond those stated goals, the FCC also plays an important role in safeguarding some of our most important and fundamental rights. The FCC ensures that our nation maintains the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The First Amendment, I really believe, is our pressure release valve as a country to speak your mind. And the FCC is crucial in ensuring Americans can express themselves, agree, disagree, and ensure dissent is protected. In carrying out the agency's duties, the FCC ensures that we're able to connect with friends and family, but also exercise our fundamental rights of freedom of speech and hear differing viewpoints. An FCC commissioner must commit himself or herself to these noble goals. And commissioners should work with Congress to protect Missourians and every American's right to freedom of speech. Our republic simply cannot endure if we decide that only certain individuals or certain viewpoints can be heard, silenced, or censored. Yet in direct contrast to these principles and freedoms of this country was founded upon, some of the largest companies in the history of the world, these big tech monopolies, have worked recently to silence or censor viewpoints, specifically conservative ones. The examples since you last testified in front of this committee are numerous. For example, Google censored Republican fundraising efforts in email platforms. Google on YouTube removed videos created by the Conservative Political Action Conference. Google altered search engine results related to an interview on the Joe Rogan podcast. In my previous job as AG, we filed a landmark lawsuit that exposed a lot of this, that's been amplified by the Twitter files and then subject of a lot of the hearings that are happening over in the House. What deeply concerns me is that you've spent the last 2 decades of your life pushing an agenda on behalf of these same big tech companies. The ties between you and these big tech companies are clear, numerous, and quite frankly, disturbing. Public Knowledge, the nonprofit that you founded in 2001 and served as its president, received $100,000 from Google, over $50,000 from Amazon, over $50,000 from Facebook, as well as hundreds of thousands of dollars from third-party groups connected to these big tech companies. According to public disclosures, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a foundation where you served as a board member, was one of the groups that received, and I quote, the most substantial contributions from Google's U.S. government affairs and public policy team. Your ties to Google were so tight that already back in 2007, Politico noted that you worked closely with Google on several policy issues. According to MANA, a national Latina organization, as a senior advisor to the FCC several years ago, you championed a proposal to let Google and other tech monopolies pillage minority programmers' television's content without paying for it. In 2020, you criticized my colleague, Senator Cornyn, and continue to push the big tech agenda by defending Section 230 liability protections for those companies. So my first question simply is, do you honestly expect the members of this committee or the American public to believe that you can be neutral with this long history and conflict of interest?
Absolutely. And let me say first, Senator, nice to meet you as well, that the FCC does not have jurisdiction over Google. I had to provide every single radio, television, and news article that I was quoted in for the last 10 years. You will see, particularly in the last 5 years, I have been as critical of big tech companies as you have. So my relationship with them back in the day when they were smaller, when they promoted policies that public knowledge agreed with, yes, we were on the same side. And talking about the money, we got money from everybody. I asked money from every company. We would get money from Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, DirecTV. So we were not partisan when it came to money.
Let me ask you, because you've mentioned that some of these claims are phony, and we'll get to some of that, and I may have to come back. But do you believe so-called disinformation should be censored?
I don't think the FCC should have any role in that. No.
But largely speaking, I mean, in this government, there has been a ministry of truth propped up, right?
Senator, I actually have a difference of opinion than some of my colleagues about disinformation, and certainly government should not censor it, no.
Well, let me just follow up briefly here. So in 2020, you specifically said that conservative bias on Facebook and Twitter those claims were phony. In 2016, a whistleblower at Facebook exposed that the company would suppress news stories, including stories about Senator Romney, Senator Cruz, the ranking member of this committee. Do you think that claim is phony?
I'm not saying that claim is phony, but what I was tweeting about was the fact that there was a guy who would every week list the top viewed things on Google, or the top topics on Facebook, and 9 of the 10 of them were conservative.
Okay, well, in 2021, YouTube suspended Senator Rand Paul after he pointed out that cloth masks were ineffective, relying on President Biden's own former COVID advisor. Is that claim phony?
Excuse me?
Is that claim phony? The fact that Senator Rand Paul was taken down because he claimed cloth masks were ineffective?
I don't think that's phony, but YouTube has a right under the First Amendment to do that if they want to.
Okay, and so here's what I want to get at. Let me just wrap up.
The senator's time has expired, and you're 1 minute over.
Okay.
And so if you can stick around, you can come back. But we have
Happy
two
to.
other members, and we need to get to our lunches. So I'm trying to be respectful. Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, and thank you, Ms. Sohn, for returning to the committee to answer more questions related to your nomination as FCC Commissioner. Last year, as the committee considered your nomination, we discussed how your time on the board of directors of Locast could impact your work as an FCC Commissioner if confirmed. Following that hearing, you filed a recusal agreement to the FCC Ethics Office to recuse yourself from matters involving retransmission consent or television broadcast copyright for 3 years. And now you're recusing yourself for 4 years from the rules governing retransmission consent on any related FCC dockets. So I have 2 questions. First, why did you recuse yourself when you testified to this committee last year that a recusal was unnecessary? And second, do you believe that your recusals from these matters and dockets will negatively impact the ability of the FCC to oversee these areas within its jurisdiction?
Yeah, I voluntarily recused myself because there was such widespread concern. I think I counted 8 people on the members of the committee who were concerned about my membership of Locast and whether that would bias me or not. Now, I didn't believe I would be biased, but I thought it would be the better part of caution for me to voluntarily recuse, and this is a narrow recusal, in my opinion, a narrowly recuse from a number of issues that rarely come before the full commission, and when they do, they're usually voted on in a 4-0 manner. So my 4-year recusal was for a docket that hasn't seen any action in almost a decade, 9 years, excuse me. So that's 10, I'm losing the name of the docket. So to me, that is, it's important that I voluntarily recuse, but I don't see it really detracting from my duties. The other recusal was for retransmission consent and broadcast copyright. Again, these are things that rarely come before the full commission. Broadcast copyright never does, but retransmission consent does on occasion. Senator Fisher actually pointed out that it come before the commission, I guess 10 times in 12 years or 12 times in 10 years. But every single time it was a 4-0 decision. So I don't think it's going to take me away from the work of the commission.
Thank you. Ms. Sohn, a number of law enforcement organizations oppose your nomination to be a commissioner. These organizations are taking these positions based on your social media engagement and concerns about your position with regard to access to digital evidence. So what is your perspective regarding law enforcement's ability to access digital evidence with a valid warrant? And relatedly, what is your position on warrant-proof encryption?
Yeah, see, these are issues that I really don't have positions on. Yeah, EFF has a position on. I do think people should be able to encrypt their personal communications, but I think there has to be a balance. So, for example, under CALEA, the FCC is required, and telecom companies are required to give law enforcement access. So, of course, law enforcement should have access with a warrant to lawful communications. So, I'll be honest with you, Senator Sinema, this is one of the things that kind of baffles me, because the FCC does not have jurisdiction over encryption issues. So my personal opinion, which again is not a fully formed one because I'm not an expert on it, I don't think it's really particularly relevant to this conversation because it's nothing I would ever deal with at the FCC.
Thank you. You know, just last month, the Tucson Unified School District was hacked by a criminal ransomware gang. It held their network hostage, causing disruptions in school operations for 2 weeks. The FBI and CISA have warned for years that schools are vulnerable to cyber attacks. Now, this is just the latest of a series in cyber attacks on Arizona schools. In the Navajo Nation, a ransomware attack on the Window Rock Unified School District took their systems entirely offline, causing lengthy delays in payroll and other services. The FCC in September received a letter from the Arizona Department of Education urging them to allow schools to use E-rate funding for more advanced cybersecurity infrastructure and systems. The E-rate program currently supports broadband and basic firewall systems, but it limits aid for advanced network protection. So do you support allowing schools to use their E-rate funds to purchase a broader range of cybersecurity tools, such as advanced firewalls and other network security services?
Yeah, I think that's something that the FCC should definitely look at. I've heard about this in Arizona and other states, and I think this is something where E-rate funding, if we're talking about making sure that students, K through 12 students, have the best networks, the most secure networks, it seems to me logical, and again, the FCC would have to do a proceeding on this, to extend E-rate funding to cybersecurity tools.
Thanks. And you and I have discussed net neutrality a few times, but I wanted to follow up on those conversations. As you know, there have been decades of partisan disagreement about net neutrality, and the FCC changes the rules every administration, which leads to litigation. I think the only way for us to fix it is for Congress to pass a bipartisan bill that provides these protections while ensuring opportunity for innovation. Has your position regarding net neutrality changed since we last spoke? And do you still support using Title II of the Telecommunications Act to pursue net neutrality?
Yes, Senator, my position hasn't changed to the extent that I don't like the ping pong game any more than you do, and I would love to see Congress pass a law. However, if Congress doesn't do so, it's critically important that the FCC have oversight over broadband. And right now, for good or for ill, Title II with a lot of forbearance. So in 2015, when I was at the FCC, we forbore from 90% of Title II. I think, unfortunately, is the only answer. But I would welcome the opportunity to work with Congress to craft a bill that gives the FCC some authority over broadband oversight and deals with net neutrality.
Senator Young.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Ms. Sohn. Welcome to the committee. I have to say, in preparing for this hearing and watching your exchange with some of my colleagues before, I have to say I've been reminded of a number of concerns that I have about your nomination. You're, of course, entitled to free speech. You're not entitled to a Senate confirmation. I know you understand that. Last time you came before this committee, we discussed your voluntary recusal from retransmission consent issues and what so many have been calling the Sohn rule for recusal. How is it going to be defined moving forward? Based on a number of the issues that were raised here today and some in previous hearings, it seems that this rule, so to speak, may come into play for many other topics. The FCC is a public interest regulator, and the American people, of course, deserve a full-time commissioner that won't be forced to recuse him or herself from relevant issues. And on top of that, if you don't recuse yourself from a number of different issues, it's become clear that the American people can't necessarily trust that you'll make objective decisions in furtherance of the public interest. We need a fair and impartial regulator at this powerful federal agency. A former Democratic colleague of ours has called for a new nominee due to your, quote, extremist tactics, unquote. The Progressive Policy Institute opposes your nomination. This is not a GOP or a conservative front group. They've cited your, quote, pattern of illiberal intolerance for voices on the left, who dissent from your hard left orthodoxies, unquote. Frank Washington, he's a veteran of the Carter administration, and he wrote, and of the FCC, and he wrote an op-ed opposing your nomination and detailing what I will say is a cozy relationship with big tech. In that op-ed, he went on to write, "What's most troubling is the patronizing mindset she's displayed toward minority communities, an all too familiar strain of progressivism that invokes our cause and showcases our voices when convenient, but then belittles us if we challenge their central planning orthodoxies," unquote. Additionally, you've accused members of Congress of being bought and paid for, and yet you've apparently made a host of generous political donations to United States senators while your nomination was pending before this very committee. Finally, I'm most concerned with the letters that we have received from numerous law enforcement organizations, and this has been mentioned before: the Fraternal Order of Police, National Sheriff's Association, the National Association of Police Organizations. These letters highlight concerns about your liking and retweeting of posts on social media about defunding the police. The National Sheriff's Association states, "Law enforcement officers across the country risk their lives every day to protect and serve our communities. They deserve the support of senior officials in the federal government who help to set policy. Unfortunately, Ms. Sohn has failed to provide such support by using social media to promote alarming statements that denigrate law enforcement," unquote. The FOP states that your public record is disqualifying to become a member of the FCC, and their letter further highlights that a vote to favorably report Ms. Sohn's nomination would show a complete disregard for the hardworking men and women of law enforcement who are simply trying to do their jobs and protect the public. As I said before, we need a fair and impartial regulator at the FCC, and the litany of concerns raised by a variety of stakeholders give me great hesitation as to whether you'll be able to serve in that capacity. Can you please, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond, can you please address the concerns raised by left-leaning stakeholders, for example, that you are intolerant to views that are not far enough left for you?
Yeah, that's, I've never heard that before, actually. And actually, I have a reputation of bringing people of all different ideologies together. I just think that's false. Let me talk about the allegations of bias, because they cut very deep for me, because I take them very, very seriously. And I have conferred with ethics counsel, both at the White House and also at the FCC, to make sure that I will be free of bias. And if somebody believes that I will be biased in a particular docket, they can raise that with the FCC, and I will talk to ethics officials. So I pledge to you that if there's an allegation of bias, that I will talk to agency officials and make sure that I can participate.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Sohn, I have had continuing concerns about you from your previous two hearings, and my concerns are only increased during this hearing. This is a hugely important position. It relates to free speech in America, it relates to liberty, it relates to elections. It encompasses so much. And I think you have demonstrated here and through your actions that you are far left partisan, whose public record demonstrates a profound lack of judgment, lack of candor, professionalism, and very importantly, temperament needed to be an FCC chairman or an FCC commissioner. And by the way, there are all these talks about smears, character assassinations, vitriol. The chairman mentioned that. I'm simply going to ask you about your statements. And if there's any vitriol in this hearing, it's coming from your words, not our words. So let me begin by an issue that's directly in your wheelhouse, if you were confirmed. You said, quote, "For all my concerns about Facebook, I believe that Fox News has had the most negative impact on our democracy. It is state-sponsored propaganda." Now, millions of people watch Fox News. I happen to be one of them. Before Fox News came on the air, there was very little conservative voices. So do you still believe Fox News is state-sponsored propaganda? And if they came before you as a commissioner, you certainly would recuse yourself, wouldn't you? I mean, this is not just a minor statement. You are calling them the most negative impact on our democracy and state-sponsored propaganda. Is MSNBC state-sponsored propaganda?
So Fox News actually, the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction over Fox News, and just as an...
If the FCC or any of its entities came before, if Fox News or any related entity came before the FCC, would you recuse yourself?
No, in fact, I help Fox Broadcasting.
Answer
I help Fox Network actually get on the air.
Do you know, when you call something state-sponsored propaganda, isn't that a little bit of a bias? The answer is yes.
Conversation,
Come on, be direct with this
Senator, if I may. I was talking about, I was in the context of a Section 230 hearing where folks were talking about disinformation on platforms. And the point that I was making in that tweet was that the government, if the government's going to look at platforms, they also need to look at Fox News.
I think, look, I have a lot of questions for you, and I'm going to try to be respectful, but I also, if I think you're filibustering, I'm going to cut you off. I think when you call an entity having one of the most negative impacts on our democracy and state-sponsored propaganda, and you have control over speech, that's a giant problem, and it certainly shows a lack of judgment and a bias. So, by the way, a bias on conservative views. Let me go to another issue that's very troubling to me, and it's your open disdain for Republicans, okay? Now, you've said, quote, Republicans know that the only way they can win an election is to suppress the vote. Wow, that's not my view. That's not the view of Republicans here. The only way Republicans can win is to suppress the vote. You also said, maybe, quote, maybe next elections, Republicans will stop beating up on gays and women. I mean, do you understand how just ridiculously infuriating statements like this are? You are ripping half of the country. Do you realize that?
So let me address the one about...
Now just answer my question. Do you apologize for these statements? By the way, and when people say this has nothing to do with the FCC, baloney. This is about free elections. You are saying you think Republicans want to suppress the vote. Do you understand how offensive these kind of statements are? And by the way, how untrue they are. These aren't retweets. These are your statements. You want to talk about vitriol for America? This is pouring gas on American partisanship.
Senator, let her answer the question.
Senator,
get to two more people.
Yeah, I've admitted that some of my tweets were sharp and more partisan than I would even prefer. However, that tweet in particular was in reaction to what happened in Harris County, Texas, where the Republican leadership shut down drive-through voting. And that, again, has nothing to do, that was my opinion.
I have another question.
So you have to have the context.
Actually, you do, but you don't, right? I mean, you're making a statement. Republicans know the only way they can win an election is to suppress the vote. It's offensive. And it is, and it goes your character, goes your judgment. Let me just mention one other, and then I'm going to come back in round two. You keep saying that you're, quote, baffled by opposition by police forces. Baffled. And I know we've talked about it. The National Association of Police Organizations, they're very against you. And it's not because of the security of information. It's retweeting things like armed goons and riot gear, defunding the police. They're saying it's profoundly concerning to us that a nominee for the commissioner of the FCC has harbored such an openly and hostile and defamatory views of the police. I was just out with the Anchorage PD doing a ride-along recently. Why on earth would you be baffled by their opposition when you are making statements or supporting statements that are so derogatory? It's obvious why. Because you're coming at them so hard. Why would you be baffled?
I'm baffled because there's 11 out of 18,000 tweets of mine, there's 11 tweets. Most of them were police brutality is bad. Police shouldn't have tanks and be in armored vehicles.
Armed goons?
What's that?
Armed goons?
Okay, well, again,
You're baffled that they're opposing you after you call them armed
That's
goons?
one tweet out of 18,000.
It's one tweet enough to make you disqualified, in my view. And the law enforcement in America right now is undergoing profound challenges. And it is also remarkable, you mentioned it, that the FCC doesn't have a lot of authority over law enforcement, but that law enforcement is coming out so strongly against you. And it's because you're driving a narrative that is so harmful to them. And by the way, it's untrue. They're not armed goons, they're heroes. And you got to apologize for all of these.
Senator Sohn, thank you. I don't know if that was your second round or if you went over a couple minutes, but we do want to go to that quickly if we can. I know people have to get to other things, but I do want to accommodate members. So Senator Cruz and then Senator Schmidt and then, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just as a housekeeping matter, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 4 different things: a letter from the Log Cabin Republicans opposing Ms. Sohn's nomination, a letter from numerous police groups opposing Ms. Sohn's nomination, and a letter from FCC Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, former commissioner, about the program under Mr. Roop.
Without objection.
Ms. Sohn, I think you have a long and consistent career as a zealous partisan advocate. There is a role for partisan advocates. It just doesn't happen to be on an independent agency charged with overseeing communications in the United States. You also have a consistent pattern of being unable to perceive conflicts of interest, whether it is deceiving this committee and the White House about the sweetheart settlement that you signed the day after your nomination was announced, or whether it is being the only nominee I've seen in a decade to make contributions to senators who are voting on your nomination while your nomination is pending, or whether it is bizarrely supporting an extreme group that blasts multiple senators from both parties. Now, I asked you about Joe Manchin and the group Fight for Our Future, where they ran billboards saying Joe Manchin is corrupt. You said you didn't agree with that. I asked you whether you agreed with them that John Tester is corrupt. You said you didn't agree with that. I asked you whether you agreed with them that Gary Peters is corrupt. You said you didn't agree with that. Well, I didn't get to finish.
Wait, are you going to go to me?
Oh, I am.
Okay.
Because she's attacked you too, but vicariously.
I'm not sure she has. I think an organization
the group
she belongs
that but not just belongs
Don't
to,
even
raises
belong.
money for. So this group also ran the following billboard. It is a picture of Senator Sinema, also a member of this committee, and it's not subtle. In case you want to miss the message they're trying to convey, it's in bright red right at the top. It says, Sinema is corrupt. Do you agree with their sentiment that Senator Sinema is corrupt?
Of course not.
Of course not. Okay, you say of course not. So that billboard went up in 2019. At the end of 2019, what did you do? You sent out a fundraising email for this organization at the end of 2019, so after they had put this billboard up. Did you know about the billboards they put up attacking Manchin and Peters and Tester and Sinema?
I only actually knew the one about Senator Sinema. I didn't know about the other ones either.
Okay, so you knew they'd called Senator Sinema corrupt.
I did.
And after they called Senator Sinema corrupt, you asked people to contribute to them. Is that correct?
I asked people to contribute, not because of all of their
That's a yes or no
tactics. One
question.
time. Yes, I did.
Okay, so you knew they were calling Senator Sinema corrupt, and you asked them to contribute afterwards. And by the way, the next year, so this is 2019, you know, these tactics, you don't mind. You were aware of them. You've testified you knew about them, at least with regard to Senator Sinema, and you wanted people to support them. You also did it again in 2020, and Chairman Cantwell asked if I was going to ask about her. I'd like to point out this same group sent a letter to Chuck Schumer demanding that Chuck Schumer remove Senator Cantwell as the chairman of the Commerce Committee. Why? Because this committee hadn't confirmed you yet. Now, I think that's a pretty extreme proposition. I gotta say, I've never seen a nominee or a group that the nominee fundraises for demand her own party's chairwoman be fired because you haven't been confirmed yet. Do you understand why this seems one heck of a conflict of interest?
I don't see how it's a conflict of interest, sir.
Does it seem impartial, or does it seem like an extreme partisan willing to burn everything down if either party doesn't do what you want?
Senator, I don't agree with all of Fight for the Future's tactics. However,
except you raise money for them, you know about them,
I don't
and you raise money
for them.
You send tweets every year asking people to contribute. When you ask people to contribute, that's called raising money. Let me ask you, does the FCC have an obligation to defend democracy?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, okay. I'd like to look at chart number 15. Chart number 15, you tweeted, and I'm going to read. I agree that scrutiny of big tech is essential, as is scrutiny of big telecom, cable, and media. And trust me, the latter have played their own role in destroying democracy and electing autocrats, like, say, Fox News. Millions of Americans watch Fox News. You believe Fox News. As you said, this is not a retweet. This is you tweeting that Fox News plays a role in destroying democracy. Do you understand why millions of people don't think you're fair and impartial to regulate communications?
Fox News is not regulated by the FCC. And yeah, I have some issues with Fox News. I also have some issues with...
Destroying democracy, that's not little. Let's look at number 16. Senator Sullivan asked you about that. You describe Fox News as state-sponsored propaganda. You want to talk about vitriolic rhetoric? Senator Sullivan is right. It's coming from you. These are your words. What about Fox News is state-sponsored? You know, you talk a lot about private actors. Last I checked, Fox News is not part of the government. I want you to explain those two words, state-sponsored. Why? Because state sponsors suggest that at the FCC, you would use government regulatory power to go after them and silence them. What did you mean by state-sponsored?
What I meant by that, and again, remember, I regretted the tone of that, was that they were very, very, very close to the Trump administration. And the two of them were sort of interacting. That's why I called it state-sponsored.
Can I ask you one final question? Yeah. Is MSNBC very, very close to the Biden administration?
I haven't the slightest idea. I don't watch it.
You don't watch MSNBC?
I do not. I don't watch CNN either. I listen to NPR, honestly. I don't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't like screaming chyrons from anybody, to be honest.
I'm going to take my time, if I could, here for my second round. And then just to clarify, you have a lot of conservative support. And I know that News Corp and various people have been supporters of you. And, you know, it's kind of interesting listening to everything today because I know these people know you in totality, right? And so it's interesting that now people are trying to capture a moment of a retweet or a statement when in reality, these very conservative organizations who have been active in this space, like News Corp or the former Fox official or others, because I'm assuming that they know your work and know your policy on important issues as it relates to competition. So, I guess, where is that?
Wrong
sure what's up there? Oh, okay. I didn't even know that chart existed, but that's okay. Okay. A chart of Republicans, I guess, that you said something nice about. Okay, we'll go back to my opening statement, which was literally about the number of endorsements that you've had from conservatives. So I wanted to go back to that because the issue is, what are these policies that you think are pro-competition issues, that you think help keep the airspace? I know this is going to shock Senator Cruz, but you know what? I would love to work with the two of you and come up with something on free speech because it is being challenged right now. And I don't think everybody is comfortable with a bunch of executives that say that they created an advisory committee and can swing back and forth about what it is they do and don't do. We had the Facebook whistleblower here, and basically they had ignored pleas from my office, from my constituents, to take down hate messages against the Rohingya in what was happening in Myanmar, and Facebook refused to do it. And I don't mean like once, I mean like with legal threats refused to do it. So I don't think any of us want this world where we think a bunch of, execs are calling the shots on what we need for free speech. So I know you believe in free speech. And I think that's why they're supporting you. If I'm reading the quotes correctly, they're saying these conservatives are supporting Gigi Sohn because she believes in free speech. So, but, In addition, we've had a transformative landscape here as it relates to broadcasters, right? And I want many voices in broadcasting, because I think if you have competition in broadcast information, I think you will get better information. True competition will get you more perfect information. Then on this other issue, we're trying to push a lot of dollars at broadband, but still not getting where we need to go. So what can you tell me that you would support in both of these areas that are competitive features that would help us? I'm disturbed that our colleagues have spent so much time talking about your personal associations, because I think they know you're a pro-consumer person. And so, but I'd like to debunk the anxiety here and just talk about what are those pro-consumers competitive ideas that you have.
Well, for local broadcasting, I think we need to revisit the media ownership rules, because they've led to enormous consolidation. And if we really care about local broadcasting and diversity in broadcasting, the last FCC basically, for all intents and purposes, eliminated those rules. And I think we need to go back and look at that and look at other ways that we might be able to promote local broadcasting, particularly ownership by minority and women. There's another issue that is right in the FCC's wheelhouse, which Senator Cruz, you just put out a statement about a little while ago, and that's the deplatforming of Newsmax and OAN. I don't know why DirecTV deplatformed them. I spilled blood trying to get them on platforms, the predecessor to OAN called Wealth TV, but also Newsmax. So I'm very troubled by that. But I fear that there may be some competitive issues at play. I don't know the actual facts, but I think it's something the FCC should investigate. You know, these guys are real independent programmers, right? They've got one channel, or maybe they have two channels, and they often get knocked out off of platforms because somebody can bundle 15 channels, right? Or, you know, or they have these, what these called most favored nation clauses. So I think, you know, the FCC, because we've been so busy working on broadband, the FCC's been so busy working on broadband that sometimes these important media consolidation issues kind of get pushed by the wayside. So I think this is an opportunity, the deplatforming of Newsmax, to look at some of the practices around bundling and most favored nation clauses.
Senator Schmidt, did you have a second round?
I did, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You know, beyond some of the concerns that have been brought to light of the connections with big tech and some of these really inflammatory statements that you still have not apologized for, you've called them sharp, but I really find it astounding that you have not apologized for some of these statements, especially with regard to law enforcement. But beyond that, I wanted to explore your advocacy for massive economy-changing regulations like net neutrality. In my preparation for this hearing, I did go back and watch some of your previous exchanges before this committee. And in particular with Senator Lee and Senator Semina, you essentially said, and I think you've said it here today, that Congress should act on this issue, but if Congress doesn't act, then the FCC can. Now, since you were here last time, of course, the Supreme Court decided the West Virginia versus EPA case, which narrows rulemaking authority for agencies, including the FCC, on major questions of economic and political significance, of course, the major questions doctrine. And so I don't have a lot of time, so I want to ask you, because I am very interested in knowing, a couple of simple questions. First, do you believe that the FCC can implement massive regulations that would have wholesale restructure an economic sector, or massive regulations that are political or economically significant? Do you believe the FCC can do that?
Well, Senator, it's hard for me to answer that question without more specifics.
Well, what about net neutrality? I'm asking you specifically.
Let's talk about net. I think that's.
Well, I actually, so I've laid it out. I don't have a lot of time. Net neutrality, you know what that is, and you know what the major questions doctrine is. Do you believe you can act on that?
So the problem is that the Brand X case is a direct contravention of the West Virginia case.
Ma'am, I'm just going to ask you, yes or no, do you think you can act on net neutrality if Congress doesn't act?
I think the FCC can and has the authority to act. It doesn't mean it won't be challenged, and the West Virginia case is going to be a challenge for net neutrality rules.
But you see, you understand the importance of that case was A lot of bureaucrats will say, this is ambiguous, there is gray area. They have narrowed that down specifically so that, in fact, bureaucrats and regulars can't act on these sorts of issues without Congress acting, because it's a part of a broader structure here, right? The Constitution was created to make sure the people, the Article 1 branch, has these decisions because they're accountable. You can send us here and you can send us home or you can send us back. They can't do anything about you after you get past this hearing. And I've just asked you a question, if you think you can act on this, and you said you have, and you have no ability to do that.
Well, Senator, again, Chevron still is good law, and I've lived by Chevron and died by.
But Chevron has been modified. You would admit that, correct?
Well, you know, it hasn't been modified.
Well, then let's add another thing to the list of reasons why you shouldn't be confirmed. Because the EPA case makes very clear that people who might, you want to be in a position where you can do this. And what it appears to me is that regardless of what the law says, regardless of what now the Supreme Court of the United States precedent is, that you think you can act on issues of major and economic significance or political significance just because you're frustrated Congress hasn't. You see how that might be a problem, right?
I don't think it's a problem because there's the Brand X case is opposite. So the Brand X case says that the FCC has the authority to decide whether broadband is a telecommunications service and an information service. And that's kind of the crux of net neutrality. Now, whether the FCC could actually adopt net neutrality rules, I think that's a more difficult question. I'll be honest with you.
So on net neutrality specifically in 2015, in 2020, you said that the 2015 implementation of net neutrality order that then President Obama, it wasn't enough. You said, quote, I'm not advocating for just reinstating the old rules. So even if the questionable legality of the constitutionality of your actions, your comments demonstrate that you actually want to go much further than that. And based on my review of your record, your statements, by the way, I was just referring to statements you made before. You made very clear that even after the EPA West Virginia case, you're doubling down on this, that your willful ignorance of that ruling, I have strong concerns that you'll be unbiased, which I've indicated before, in an independent agency that has broad authority, and instead be pushing a radical agenda that you want. And I would submit to you that if that's what you want to do, you ought to run for office. You ought to run for the Senate. You ought to run for Congress. But I think you're trying to do an end around here by being on the FCC and getting what you actually want, which is not how this system was set up. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Sohn. I think you're getting a sense of frustration here. And you keep talking about context. Let me give you some context. You know, you're one of a long line of Biden administration nominees who have made tweets and statements about Republicans being white supremacists, Republicans want to suppress the vote, Republicans, quote, beating up women and gays, that's your quote, racists. And you know what? It's just tiring. It's really tiring. It was almost at one point, it seemed like if you made one of these statements in a tweet, the Biden administration put you at the top of the list to nominate you, right? So you're part of that cohort, and it's frustrating. Do you understand why people get frustrated? Do you understand why millions of Americans look at this and go, really problematic? She does not have the temperament making these statements. Do you understand that?
I understand that people are frustrated, and I don't like the partisanship either. Okay, you know, things have gotten sharper since 2016.
But you keep saying sharper, but you're going to have enormous power if you're an FCC commissioner. Let me just make two final points. One is just a correction for the record. You probably don't know it, but in terms of OAN, the president of OAN just tweeted out, your lack of support for diverse voices makes her unqualified to be an FCC commissioner. That's Charles Herring. Maybe he's watching the hearing and has changed his view. And similarly, the CEO of OAN just said, One American News, the CEO and owner just tweeted that OAN does not, and will never support Ms. Sohn for commissioner. So just correcting the record, because I think earlier you said OAN supports you. I think definitively they don't. Let me ask a final question, which is a really important one, and it relates to the policies that you would be really overseeing. And it relates to rural broadband connectivity for rural communities. You know, we just had an infrastructure bill that focused on this. A lot of people talk about it, and you have, you know, it's important for urban areas to go from 4G to 5G. You know, I always raise my hand and say, hey, what about no G? What about no G? My state, is not connected at all. And so the infrastructure bill prioritized rural communities, and yet you have, again, come out with, I believe, an elitist urban rural view on broadband connectivity. And I'm not going to quote from you. I'm going to quote from a op-ed from Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who last year wrote an op-ed entitled, "Gigi Sohn is wrong for the FCC in rural America." I'd like to submit that for the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection.
So in it, Senator Heitkamp, Democrat Senator Heitkamp, said that in your testimony before the House Energy and Commerce Committee, you said, quote, "Policymakers have focused disproportionately on broadband development in rural areas of the United States," unquote. Then, this is Senator Heitkamp talking here, Sohn also criticized the FCC broadband policies and claimed they made it, quote, "really easy for rural broadband companies," this is now she's quoting you, "to basically suck at the government's teat to the tune of tens of billions of dollars," unquote. It's pretty vitriolic in my view. And then here's how Senator Heitkamp summarizes her op-ed against your confirmation. Quote, "Given the significant progress that's been made in closing the rural digital divide in recent years and all the important work that remains to fully close the gap, this deeply cynical view of rural broadband by Gigi Sohn does not inspire confidence." I couldn't agree more. This is a gigantic issue for me and my constituents and for Democrats and Republicans. So do you still think senators like me, quote, "focus disproportionately on broadband development in rural areas"? I guarantee you, my constituents who have no G would fundamentally disagree with you.
Yes, Senator, just because I said they disproportionately focus doesn't mean that I don't support all efforts. And like I said, I was one of the biggest supporters of the BEAD program in the infrastructure bill. That doesn't mean I don't support rural broadband, but there has been, and particularly at the time, not so much now, okay? It's interesting.
I'm quoting you from 2020.
Right, correct. I was testifying at a hearing about closing the digital divide and digital equity. And I wanted to make the point that nobody really was talking about the digital divide in cities at the time, and that everybody was only talking about rural. Now we're talking about urban and rural, and I think that's really good.
But you make the statement makes it sound like
because it's taken out of context.
You're critical of legislators who are trying to close the rural divide. It makes me nervous about what you will do if you become the commissioner with now not only an anti-conservative view, an anti-Republican view, you have an anti-rural America view, and it's not just me saying it. Heidi Heitkamp said it.
Senator, if you would meet with me, and I think we are going to meet, so I'm really happy about that, you will see that I know more about how to fix the digital divide in Alaska than most people, okay? And I'd really love to talk to you about the substance because I've got all kinds of ideas. I share some of your concerns about the rural health care program, about other programs. I care, and I have a lot of support in your state. Hopefully you've heard from some of them. So I do care deeply, particularly about your state and making sure everybody has broadband, because I know it's the least connected state.
It is.
So I hope we do have an opportunity to actually talk about what's real in your state, because I think I would be a fantastic commissioner for the state of Alaska.
I'm even willing to join that meeting, just as I've joined other Alaska infrastructure meetings.
I want to compliment the chair on these kind of issues.
No, it really is important. I mean, Alaska does have a very, very unique challenge, and all the things that you think you're going to do for all the rest of the states is not going to work in Alaska, so it needs its own plan. So I appreciate that, and I will happily attend that meeting. So this is the close of our hearing. Before we close, I'd like to confirm, Ms. Sohn, if you pledge to work collaboratively with the committee, provide thorough and timely responses to requests for information, that you put together important policy papers and appear before the committee when requested.
Yes.
Senators will have until the close of business Friday, February 17th to submit questions for the record. Thank you all. That concludes our hearing.